The majority of you joining today will be current Carbon Trust clients, so thank you for attending, and we hope that the agenda we've prepared will bring you lots of insight and inspire you to continue to drive change within your organisations. We'll be having some breakout sessions at 11:15 today, during which we'll hear from our sector leads and have the opportunity to share and learn from some of your peers. So if you're not able to stay for the whole session, we do recommend that you come back and join us for those at 11:15. In terms of housekeeping, we've just asked that you ensure that you are muted and that you turn your videos off for the main sessions. In the breakout sessions, we of course would encourage you to unmute and also use your videos so that you can engage with those. You can use the chat function throughout the event today, so please do send through your questions for our team and for our guest speakers as well. We're going to begin the event by asking you to complete a poll, so if you could please go on to Slido and using the event code that you can see shown on screen here, you'll be able to complete the poll. You'll also be able to see the results live on your devices, and we'll discuss these later on as well. Now, I'm sure that you are all aware that COP26 is currently taking place, and this is obviously a crucial point in time for setting out how we'll meet international climate goals and how we will action this within the next decade. And joining us from COP this morning, we have our opening keynote speaker and Chief Executive of the Carbon Trust, Tom DeLay.
Tiff, hi, good morning. Thanks very much, and a very warm welcome from me to everybody here as well. It's a bit of a cheat. I'm not quite at COP. I got back in the early hours this morning after a fairly late night back. COP is an extraordinary event. It always is an extraordinary event, and this one is particularly acute. And of course, being in Glasgow, very close to home for many of us. So what I'd like to do is just extend a very warm welcome to everybody today for the sessions. It's a terrific morning, and hopefully people will get a lot out of it. I know many of the sessions will be linked into Glasgow and COP, which I think is nice. But also it's a chance to reflect on broader changes that we've seen in the sector over the last year. It really has picked up momentum very, very significantly, and I'm going to come back to that in a second. So yeah, what's COP all about? Many of you might have had the chance to go to COPs, multiple, single, might yet go to Glasgow if you haven't been yet, because of course it's over 2 weeks. I was there from the beginning until, as I say, early this morning. COPs are crazy. I've described it as Freshers' Week for environmentalists. 15, 20,000 people running around looking for something to do, somebody to talk to, trying to understand what the hell they're doing there. And yet it all falls into place. And overwhelmingly, I think the sense is that it's the right thing to do. It keeps momentum going. It brings together all of the parties. That's what the conference is all about. It's bringing together everybody. So my abiding first memory of COP26 in Glasgow was high-vis jackets and the police. Arriving on the first day, the police literally put a cordon around what they called an island, so much so that you couldn't get from the station to the event. And various police gave us various indications, including go back and take a taxi, to go under the fly pass across a 3-lane dual carriageway, cross over the Armco barrier at the far end, and you can walk down an alleyway, which is what actually a number of us did. So high-vis jackets, enormous security everywhere. When you finally get into the event, you have to show lateral flow tests of the day, as well as a vaccine record to get in. So there's a lot of security, a lot of vaccines being actually passed out, and people doing vaccines there and then on the spot. And then you join a queue. And queues are always bad. I'm afraid this was probably some of the worst. People were typically queuing for between an hour and 2 hours to get in. And it's airport style checks. So it's a bit frustrating because actually nothing to do with COVID. This is just straightforward security. Overwhelmingly, you walk inside and it's all about chaos. Lots of people running around, delegations walking past, the odd head of state that you'll recognize, lots of security people around them, but a kind of organized chaos with lots of things up on the walls telling you where you could be at any one time. There are, I counted, over 80 country pavilions. These are areas where individual countries will set out their stall, and it's a chance for people to meet and do things. And in the background of all of that, you've got a couple of enormous halls where, you know, heads of state will talk, and a lot of offices where all the negotiation actually takes place. So, you know, pretty chaotic. Just to give a sense of kind of what might come up, I'll make it personal. Yesterday, I had a chance to meet Minister Diego Mesa from Colombia. Some of you who might have seen the great climate debate on TV on BBC One Monday evening will have seen he was one of the panelists. He's extremely articulate, brilliant young man. And we talked about Colombia and the challenges he's facing. Interestingly, starts off with demand. We can deal with supply. We need to manage demand to make best use of our renewable facilities and our renewable capacity in Colombia. He's looking to roll out smart meters, but there are social issues with rolling out smart meters at the moment in Colombia, so that's on hold. He has enormous potential wind and solar capacity in the northeast of Colombia. And not surprisingly, a lot of people queuing up to invest in those. What's interesting is that being that much closer to the equator, the balance and the resilience of the renewable capacity, be it solar or wind, is far greater than we see in the UK. So the need for storage and interconnectors whilst it's there is very different to that we have. And lastly, Colombia is the 6th biggest exporter globally of coal. Which presents them with a whole set of issues, both in terms of a just transition, but also how to capitalize on the enormous renewable potential, whilst at the same time living on top of you know, a significant reserve of coal that is expected to be used. So a country hedging its bets between green and blue hydrogen sounds familiar, just like the UK, for very different reasons. So that was Colombia. And I then went across and gave a talk at the China Corporate Pavilion. Now, China doesn't have a country pavilion this year for all kinds of political reasons, but it does have a corporate pavilion supported by a philanthropic organization with many Chinese corporates anchoring onto that. And in fact, both Al Gore and the lead Chinese negotiator came in at the beginning of the launch event that I was at. And I was able to talk a bit about net zero and what we're going to talk about this morning. And I did finish off by talking about some of the work that we're doing in China. And it's worth just highlighting it because it shows how in countries like China, many of the same challenges that we face here in the UK exist. The first example was a company called Envision. Envision is an enormous, very progressive organization, essentially developing all kinds of green solutions, renewables, and so on at very large scale. People will be familiar with Envision, and it has a very ambitious plan to be carbon neutral on its own estate, as it were, by 2022, but also be carbon neutral across its entire value chain by 2028. And that's a very significant investment, and we've been helping Envision with that for a number of years now. The second example I gave was one that was particularly representative and people in the audience really picked up on. And it was the work that we've been doing led through Decathlon. So Decathlon, the sports good retailer, is very ambitious, has science-based targets, needs to look at scope 3, needs to look up its value chain to achieve that. And basically, we've been working with Decathlon and a number of their suppliers to help both Decathlon achieve genuine, credible scope 3, but also obviously the various suppliers in China get their own science-based targets in order. Arcana Power is a manufacturer of large professional gym equipment. And we've been working with Arcana Power, and I explained how that was tied into Decathlon's story. And lastly, my example from China included Weichao Pioneering. Now, you might not have heard of Weichao Pioneering. It's an enormous state-controlled entity in China, known for its textiles, but perhaps more importantly for aluminium. It's the largest aluminium company in the world. And they are starting from ground zero. They've never really done a great deal, and therefore the starting point to develop their corporate strategy has got to be to establish and measure their scope 1, 2, and 3 carbon footprint, and we've been helping them with that. So 3 very different examples that I shared at COP from our work with China, but actually all examples which resonate to my mind with the market that we have in the UK. In the last couple of minutes before I hand over, really I'd just like to make one other sort of comment. It's all around momentum. I started with momentum, I'm going to finish with momentum. The sector is absolutely flying. And that's great. And it was terrific up at COP to see so many countries, so many organizations pushing so hard in the right direction. Having said that, there was palpable greenwash around the place, and it didn't take a very finely tuned eye to see it all over the place. And I think it's inevitable. If you have that level of momentum, that level of hype, people want to join on, and all of a sudden you end up in a greenwash position. And as the Carbon Trust, we recognize that we are very fortunate to be truly independent. We have no shareholders. We're not owned by anybody. We simply operate the way we do. We have a commitment to reinvest any surplus we make commercially into our mission, which is to accelerate the move to a decarbonized future. Very straightforward. It's what we're here for. And our independence, I think, is something that is even more important today than it has been maybe in the past. And as a result of that, we have decided to reposition to some degree the Carbon Trust brand. I think we're going to be bolder. I think we're going to be more outspoken on things where we should be. So you're probably going to see a lot more of the Carbon Trust, as I say, with a tone of voice that is going to be somewhat bolder than it might have been in the past. And to go along with all of that, we've got a new visual identity, not radically different. If you look very carefully at the Carbon Trust logo on the screen, you'll see that it has changed. It's easier to read. It's easier to read in very small font on a phone, and that's increasingly important. But it's exciting, and it's really another opportunity that we've got, given our independence, to really make a mark in the sector going forward. So look, that's all from me. Have a really terrific morning. I will be listening in and joining in as appropriate. And let me hand over now to Tiff for the rest of the event.
Thank you, Tom. Great to hear about all the different interconnected challenges that different countries and economies face, and also about ambitious climate action going on around the world. And like you say, you know, momentum is what we need, but it needs to be credible momentum. So next on our agenda, I am pleased to introduce our next keynote speaker of the morning, Elliot Whittington. Elliot leads the CISL's team that bridges between business and policymakers to bring about a more sustainable economy. So Elliot is director of the CISL's Corporate Leaders Group, leading the team behind both the European and the UK Corporate Leaders Group. He also leads the CLG Europe's Green Growth Partnership with leading EU climate and environment ministers, which creates a common space for governments, businesses and parliamentarians to collaborate in support of a greener EU economy. Today, he'll be talking to us about achieving net zero and how businesses and policy action is needed to come together to transform the UK economy.
Tiffany, thank you. I'm very glad to be here, and it's fascinating to hear Tom's introduction and that overview of what's happening in COP. I'm shortly to join a team of people that CISL has at COP. And I mean, if you want to move on to my slide set. So maybe just for anybody who doesn't know CISL and the Corporate Leaders Group. So CISL is a department in the University of Cambridge that works to support businesses, governments, investors, in tackling global challenges, in improving their sustainability through a variety of means: education, convening, research, also advisory work and small business support. But in that convening space, we run a number of major groups, and our most long-standing are our two corporate leaders groups, the UK and the European Corporate Leaders Groups, which are business leadership groups which come together to champion the transition towards a sustainable economy. And so very much on this topic of how, you know, business working with government in a positive partnership is a kind of core part of their identity. So the UK Corporate Leaders Group has been working on that agenda for nearly 16 years now. And if we move on to the next slide, one of the reasons that I think I was invited here to talk is in the summer, we put out a big piece of work around the UK's journey to net zero. And that was very much about bringing business and government together on this agenda and seeing how business and policy leadership can collaborate, can reinforce each other. And the headline messages, which I'm going to explore in today's conversation, is basically the fact that we need to move beyond setting those goals such as net zero into delivery. So it's that decade of climate action that we need to see over the next 10 years. And that the context for that delivery is that we've not really seen, we have seen much progress in the UK on the net zero agenda, but not consistent progress and not sufficient progress. So we need to think about how we bridge the gap between what we've been able to do so far and what we are setting out to do and what actually is happening. So we try to look at the different steps that business and government can take and where indeed action was at. So if we move on to the next slide, I'll kind of run through some of this in detail. When we did the report, and I think it's worth saying that this has been a year where you take a snapshot and then things change the next day or the next month. It was worth noting that, but I think this is broadly an accurate description of where we're at. So we have this patchy progress that I've talked about. So, the UK has a really strong tradition of climate leadership with the Climate Change Act. We've, going back, as I say, sort of 15, 20 years, we've been talking about this agenda, we've been setting out policies, we've been creating legal frameworks and delivering. And indeed, as a major economy that has reduced our carbon intensity, we're among the forefront of the world. I'm sure many people on the line know. So we do have that great economy-wide progress, but it's not equally advanced in all sectors. Power is the kind of like the area where we have seen most success, but it is also the core backbone of decarbonisation, being able to decarbonise electricity. Transport and buildings are huge areas where we've actually seen very little changes, although in transport in particular, there are promising signs on electric vehicles. And then agriculture and land use, actually emissions from agriculture have increased slightly, but that's also been offset by the fact that over the last 10 years or so, we've seen increased carbon storage in land because we've been seeing more trees planted and more other aspects. But this is a particularly difficult sector, but it is a sector that can't be left behind. I should note at this point, we didn't look in detail at sort of more industrial sectors, partly because we would have had to written a chapter or a level of analysis on each kind of hard to abate sectors, and indeed other actors are looking at some of that. So these are some of the big sources of emissions, but if there is more to be said on industrial emissions that we could talk about. Next slide, please. So it's also worth noting that in each of those sectors, there is huge and impressive business leadership. And I urge people to look at the Bridging the Gap report for detail on this, but just some snapshots, it's worth saying we've got, companies setting commitments and delivering actions. And again, I know the Carbon Trust works with many of them, so they will be well represented on this call. But I think it's worth sort of talking about the fact that firstly, we have systems like the Science Based Targets Initiative, which is, the UK is one of the places where more companies are taking science-based targets than anywhere else. That's hugely grown over the last year, partly supported by the fact that we have people like Andrew Griffith, the UK government's net zero business champion, who's been out there banging the drum for it. We've been doing a number of events and activities. So it was 1 in 10 companies with the science-based targets, the UK headquarters, in the summer. The number of companies who are UK headquartered with a science-based target has gone up, but the overall number has gone up. So I'm not totally sure where that balance is right now. Also worth noting, in other sectors, there are major campaigns and major activities. So in the power sector, we have the RE100 campaign supporting demand. We've also seen Energy UK, the sector kind of, a trade body setting a commitment to be a carbon neutral kind of provider by 2035. So huge commitment from the industry. Road transport, we've seen things like the UK Electric Fleets Alliance. In buildings, we've got the World Green Building Council Net Zero Carbon Buildings Standard, which has been signed up to, and lots of action by the UK Green Building Council. And in agriculture and land use, well, business includes farmers, and the National Farmers Union has set a huge kind of commitment towards net zero. So in each of these sectors, we've seen business action. It is worth saying that there is, in some places, again, across the economy, in power and in transport, it's actually quite well developed. In buildings, there are some great commitments, but it's really there is a multiplicity of them, so there isn't necessarily a good shape. And then in agriculture and land use, I think it's worth saying there isn't yet a good cross-sectoral kind of consensus about what business ambition and what the transformation looks like, that you're not seeing that kind of quite that distinction in terms of how people come together. Move on to the next slide, please. So this is I'm not going to dwell on this slide, but we very clearly, I think probably the key thing about this is to say there are key actions for businesses to take across the economy. So just to kind of pick up on that agriculture and land use piece, we saw a need for much more aligned sectoral leadership in that sector. We thought that there was more engagement than was needed on the building sector, but in other sectors there's a lot of kind of like, can we take those commitments and work to drive broader change? And that's where the business ambition needs to feed into further action and also further government action in terms of creating that right enabling framework. Next slide, please. And it's worth noting that in the 6 months since we published the report, where we've asked for a number of things, actually the government in this country have produced a number of policies and strategies, and the situation has moved on significantly. So most notably, or maybe most high profile, is we very recently saw a new net zero strategy, which is a really impressive document setting out a comprehensive economy-wide approach to delivering the UK's net zero goals and its intermediate targets. I've put here, still significant detail is on delivery is required. I think that's not entirely true for every part of it. Some parts are better developed than others, and we'll come through that as we go and work our way down. There are some really great areas, such as developing heat pumps, where there's a lot of detail in the heat and building strategy, where there is that. But actually in other areas, there are kind of more ambitions and not really the clarity on how the government is going to make those ambitions come to life. So that's actually going to be a key constraint, or a key area where the government will need to come up with a bit more detail if it really wants to respond to the business leadership that we're seeing and to be able to unlock the level of action that we want to see. Just very quickly, if I kind of go work down the list on power, very clear vision within the net zero strategy, building on the energy white paper and indeed building on the Prime Minister's 10-point plan from last year. But, noting the context, we have energy prices rising. We have a lot of controversy around that. And actually, rightly, I think the government have identified that this shows there is a need for faster action in the sector. The transport decarbonisation plan, which was published sort of just actually shortly after our report happened in the summer, does set out a really good, clear direction of travel. I think where there's more detail needed is on what the implementation of a lot of that looks like, particularly at the local level. There's a lot of infrastructure that needs to be provided. There's a lot around public transport and the resources available, but that actually needs a route to be able to kind of show what that's actually going to look like. On buildings, we have a very helpful heat and building strategy, which has clarified the landscape, but there are still kind of concerns and limitations around it in terms of, is the resourcing provided for that area enough? It's less than was promised by the government in their election manifesto. And particularly in terms of energy efficiency, the lack of any kind of regulatory driver, at least in the short term, it looks worrying. So this is an area which the UK has consistently overpromised and under-delivered, and where business, I think, has consistently asked for a clearer, firmer approach that people can invest against and train up against and so on. I think there are strong signals from government, but not yet that really clear framework. And then finally, on agriculture and land use, we've still got the environment bill going through Parliament. There are some great kind of ideas contained in the net zero strategy, but there isn't yet that kind of clear strategic approach that will really drive not only a thriving agriculture sector, but also deliver nature restoration and carbon sequestration. So, the government has done a huge amount on that, but and seeing a question, I'm just going to respond to it live. The 10-point plan, I can't remember, that was last year, if it did mention agriculture. The net zero strategy does include some sections on agriculture. So, and there's a fairly good summary where, so do have a look through that. There are some good goals in that, but as I say, it's not quite gelling, particularly in terms of what that would inform in terms of the environment bill. So there's a sense of lack of detail, lack of focus on the agricultural sector that's still not quite coming together yet. Next slide, please. So if I kind of bring that together, in conclusion, we are in a really good place this year. We do have a huge, comprehensive and systematic approach to how the country should achieve net zero. So it checks, it talks about all the kind of key sectors. It gives the right kind of aspirations in terms of the kind of level of transformation we need to see. And at the same time, we've seen this huge growing groundswell of UK businesses setting net zero goals, unveiling their policies, advancing on how they want to do that, and delivering action, investing in kind of steps and formats in growing numbers. So there is a huge kind of foundation that can be built on. But if we are to deliver on both businesses' goals and the government's goals, if we are to deliver on not only the net zero target, but the shorter term targets that people are rightly setting, then we will need to see a wave of implementation, and transformative wave of implementation. And a lot of that is, the detail of that, some of that is clear, not all of it is. So there is still a need for working through some level of detail. And there is a need for business and government collaboration in terms of defining what that looks like. So, I very clearly said business and government need to collaborate to enable the scale of change required. One area I want to pull out, which is sort of mentioned in a couple of my previous slides, but haven't called out yet, is the need to work more clearly with the smaller businesses, SMEs and startups and through the supply chain. As you will many of you know, one of the key things if you're setting these kind of climate targets, if you're having a good climate strategy, is you need to deliver it through your scope 3. So the ability to move smaller businesses is key. And that becomes particularly, if you start to break that down at a sectoral level, you start to see the need for different tools, different resources for different sectors, because, the circumstance facing an office-based small business that has a fairly low and fairly straightforward carbon footprint, one in a kind of specialist manufacturing area or a kind of agricultural supply chain is very different. So yes, absolutely, this is a role where both large businesses, but also government, need to be working out how they provide that support and resource to smaller businesses who will not necessarily automatically have the strategic ability to kind of navigate their own change. They need to be able to be given the kind of clear action so that they can take those. So we're in that kind of role of delivery. We are needing to kind of scale up and accelerate our pace of change. But we need business and government collaboration to deliver on that, to kind of continue to close those gaps that we've talked about. And I think the other thing I just wanted to pick up on this is, I think there is a key point in terms of one of the things that Tom said, which is about accountability. So, and this is a point for both business and government. The public generally have heard, I would argue, that net zero is a thing. They've heard that it's happening. They've heard that businesses are setting goals. They've heard that the government has set a goal. They've heard the country is embarking on this journey. I think there is a huge need for accountability to sort of say, where is that serious? Where is there greenwash? Where is there kind of the lack of follow through? And I think that will be a kind of growing conversation. People, NGOs, journalists, other opinion formers will be looking for those examples of, is this serious and is it actually going to be delivered in key places? So final slide. I mean, that's kind of my overview, but yeah, I'm very happy to kind of continue as part of this conversation. And as I say, I think that the key things I wanted to leave you with is this is an agenda with huge potential, huge momentum behind it, but there's a lot of detail that needs to be worked out in the delivery, and we need to get down into the sectoral things. We also need to make sure we've got the right tools to enable collaboration and partnership to deliver that forward. Thank you.
Great, thank you so much, Elliot. So great to hear about the report and all the initiatives in those key sectors, and the work still needing to be done, obviously, on the policy side and on the collaboration side as well. Also great to hear about the business leadership going on in the UK, and thanks to many of those on the call today. We know many of those organisations need and should be recognised for all the great work that they do in their respective sectors. And as such, next we're going to hear from the Carbon Trust's Head of Sales Europe, Pauline Opdebeck, who will be presenting on our route to net zero standard and how we are supporting corporates to recognise their progress on their route to net zero.
Great, thanks, Tiff, and good morning, everyone. If we could go to the next slide, please. And that was a very nice bridge, Elliot, when you were talking about accountability, because that's exactly what I'd like to talk about today, and really kind of bridging the challenges and opportunity that businesses face on the route to net zero. So before I talk a bit about the route to net zero standard specifically, I'd like to talk about the context that kind of has led us here. So if we go to the next slide, please. I'm sure many of you are familiar with this context, but I still think it's important to note how we got to where we are today and how that has informed the development of this new standard. So as we all know, in 2015, the Paris Agreement was signed and the majority of the world's countries committed to limiting global warming to well below 2 degrees. And at that point, 1.5 degrees was essentially a nice to have. But we know in 2018 with the IPCC report that 1.5 degrees is very much no longer a nice to have, but really the level of ambition that we need to reach. And it's also at this point that the term net zero becomes familiar. So this report also outlined that we need to reach net zero emissions by 2050. And that's when we start to see nation states as well as corporates starting to talk about net zero. And in June of this year, we have the G7 that committed to keeping global warming to 1.5 degrees. So really reaffirming that level of ambition that we need. And as I'm sure many of you will have seen last week, the Science Based Targets Initiative released the net zero standard. So outlining how companies should be setting net zero targets and what the kind of key methodologies are that sit underneath that. So what we see here is a growing kind of change in the policy landscape, as well as what's considered best practice amongst corporate target setting. And on the next slide, we can see that this pace of change has accelerated, the level of ambition has accelerated. Many of you in the room will have been a part of this. And we now have 2,000 companies that have set science-based targets or committed as well. And over almost half of those have also been to the 1.5 degree level of ambition. So you really see an exponential rise in the past few years of companies committing to and setting science-based targets. And even just in the last 18 months, a real explosion of companies that are committing to 1.5 degrees, which is of course fantastic. And before the Science Based Targets Initiative even released the net zero standard, net zero has become best practice in terms of long-term target setting. We of course very much welcome the standard that was released last week, because this really demonstrates in a clear document what net zero means, what the definition is, what kind of short-term and long-term targets you have to set to underpin that. And because net zero has become best practice within corporate target setting, but also on a national level, as Tom mentioned earlier on in the opening session of today's meeting, is that the Carbon Trust 2, of course, has recognized this, and we have kind of repositioned ourselves within the landscape to really take on the challenge to net zero. So it's within that context that we've developed the route to net zero standard. So many of you will be familiar with the Carbon Trust standard. This is replacing that. So as we have rebranded as a business, so too must our proprietary standard. So it's with our established experience in consulting and assuring our clients' sustainability strategies for the past 20 years that we've developed the first certification that recognizes progress and action on the journey to net zero. So the standard is for your journey towards climate leadership, trusted by your certified by your trusted partner, the Carbon Trust. And we recognize that people are at different stages as it relates to net zero. So the standard reflects that. So whether you are taking steps in moving towards that, whether you are advancing or leading the way, our trusted experts are here to help you navigate this challenging path to net zero and independently certify your progress towards it. And this is really so that you can clearly and most importantly, confidently communicate your commitment and your action on that commitment to a global audience. So if we go to the next slide, what we're really looking at here is the action associated with net zero. So as I've mentioned, and as you know, the Science Based Targets Initiative has released a standard that defines what net zero is. And we absolutely welcome that, because now you can set those targets, you can have them validated by the Science Based Targets Initiative. But as we all know, setting a target is one thing. Really transforming your business to achieve it is entirely another, and that's when the work starts. And that's really what our Route to Net Zero standard is here to help you do and communicate. So there are still a lot of uncertainties around how one actually achieves net zero and communicates it, and that's really what we're hoping to help you do. So firstly, there is the reduction component. You will have all set interim targets, long-term targets, and you will want to communicate that you are making good on those commitments. So the certification will be certifying kind of annual reductions in line with the objectives you set. So really looking at those percentage reductions across your greenhouse gas emissions. And while that is very important, you need to be on track with your targets. It's also incredibly important to communicate that you as a business understand how you are going to achieve those longer term targets. So we're really also auditing and certifying the feasibility of your implementation plan. Your investors and other stakeholders will not just be looking at the net zero target you've set and the interim targets within that, but actually, is your business on track from a transformation perspective to actually achieve that? What's the forward planning that you've done? Do you have the correct financial and operational planning to really achieve those targets? What programs are you implementing to achieve those objectives? We'll be reviewing those, assessing their feasibility and their suitability for your target, and of course, advising you on if there are gaps and how they can be bridged. And given that it's an assurance proposition, it's all about tracking and packaging this so that you can communicate it effectively over this time period to your stakeholders internally, because of course you want to communicate that progress and communicate the learnings from the process and anything that can kind of be improved and changed and further developed as the years go on and the target gets clearer, but importantly also to that external audience to really demonstrate that you are reducing in line with and adapting your business, preparing it for those longer term commitments. So what does this actually look like? On the next slide, we give a bit more information on how we intend to do this. So much like many assurance propositions, it's verifying the footprints, but it's not just, of course, verifying the numbers themselves, but really certifying the reductions that have been made over the certification period. This is done through the third-party verification process. And as I mentioned, it's not just looking at the figures and the percentages of reduction, but really also an independent verification of the efforts you are taking to align with your targets. So when we're looking at those efforts, what are we looking at? Well, it's a carbon management questionnaire, looking at the extent to which your commitments to these targets have been embedded within the business and the readiness of your business to then achieve that target. So not only will we be saying where on the scale you are with that, but giving you actionable insights on how you can improve in those particular areas and move towards your net zero commitment. And this will, of course, be provided by our experts in the specific areas. So it's, of course, not just looking at your own operations, but your value chain as well, as we know this is a key component of all net zero commitments. And while there are rules to the standard, and those will be presented in more detail when it's launched in January, the certification itself will also evolve over time. As my previous slides showed, the landscape has changed since 2015, the ambition has increased, the pace has increased, the urgency has increased, and so too must our certification adapt itself over time. For any policy or indeed corporate best practice contexts, we need to make sure that we can help you communicate on an ongoing basis that you are delivering in line with those changes. So for that reason, I'm very delighted to kind of show exactly what the standard will look like going forward. If we move to the next slide. So as I mentioned, this is the kind of informal launch, so to speak, of the standard. It's really just the audience on the call today, as well as our other regional event series that will be happening in the next few weeks. It's only going to be launched to the public in January. But as you know, our kind of really valuable clients, we wanted to share this with you first. So the certification is a tiered certification, and this is really recognizing that companies are at different stages in setting and reaching those net zero commitments. And I'll go into detail on what each of these tiers are, but all of them are recognizing historical emissions reductions, a commitment to future climate change action, and providing tailored advice for where you are on your journey and how we can help you get to that next step. So there are 3 tiers, and the first tier is called the taking steps. And for any of you familiar with the Carbon Trust Standard, the kind of requirements of this tier are essentially the same as the Carbon Trust Standard. And the idea of this tier is to really take you from where the Carbon Trust Standard is today and to move you on to those more ambitious tiers and setting those more ambitious targets. So the taking steps tier is looking at historical reductions in your operational emissions, that you have a greenhouse gas emission reduction target, and that you have the management practices within your business to achieve that. But as I said, the purpose of the advice we want to give here is really to kind of help you get to that science-based target setting level. And that's where we get to the advancing tier. Here we'll be looking for science-aligned reductions, and that you have a science-based target for scopes 1, 2, and 3, and that your management practice within the business are really aligned to that science-based commitment you have. Then we get to leading the way, which is where a company has a net zero target that is in line with 1.5 degrees as specified by the Science Based Targets Initiative. So this is where we have that very specific level of ambition that we're looking for, as well as the reduction on an annual basis associated with that. So again, we'll be certifying those reductions, and we'll be certifying that because you have this very ambitious target, that your business is transforming in line with that long-term commitment. So the qualitative assessment, when we're looking at your carbon management practices, we will be looking for the most leading elements of that within these businesses, really businesses that are starting to transform, because at the end of the day, it is that transformation that is needed to reach net zero. We move to the next slide. So just to kind of summarize what this standard is hoping to do, it is hoping to certify reductions in line with science, to certify the feasibility of your carbon implementation plans, and to help you track and communicate your route to net zero on an ongoing basis. So finally, I'd just like to move on to the next slide, please. Just to kind of sum up, the route to net zero standard is hoping to certify companies that are turning intent into impact. And I think that's really the key message here, is that it's not just about setting the right target and having the correct pathways. It's really about turning the intent of those targets into impact and into action, and actually delivering on those commitments. So we'd be delighted to talk more in detail about this. So please do get in touch with your client managers or with our client support team. As I said, this is just an initial presentation on what the standard is. It will be formally launched in January, but we'll be happy to talk more to you about it in the coming months as well. Thank you.
Great, thank you so much, Pauline. Really great insight. And yeah, as you've just mentioned, do get in touch with your client managers if you have any questions. So next on the agenda today, we have a session on the opportunities and challenges of the voluntary carbon market. So something which is, often referred to when talking about setting net zero trajectories and pathways, whether that be kind of strategies in the short term, but also in the long term. And taking us through this today, I'm pleased to introduce Vaughan Lindsay, Chief Executive of Climate Care and Natural Capital Partners, who are supporting organisations looking to meet ambitious climate goals. Together, the firms are dedicated to working with their clients and project partners all over the world and take action on climate change, delivering positive results and impact on carbon emissions, communities and the planet. So please join me in welcoming today Vaughan Lindsay.
Tiff, thank you very much, and a warm welcome to everybody from a reasonably chilly Glasgow here up in where we're here to participate in the COP. So I'm delighted to come here and share some reflections on the voluntary carbon market and how they can help close the ambition, finance and timing gap that we face as we seek to tackle climate change. So lots to be done, and we think the voluntary carbon markets can play a pretty significant role in filling that gap. Just by way of introductions, if I can go to the next slide, just so you know who we are. I shouldn't assume that you know who we are. We are Climate Care and Natural Capital Partners, two world-leading climate solution providers. And what we do fundamentally is we develop, manage and finance carbon reduction projects across the world. Currently, I think we're involved in 600 projects in 56 different countries with 36 different methodologies. So a pretty substantial reach. And we've been in the sector ever since it started. So it's interesting seeing, as Tom mentioned earlier on, about the market is getting very hot at the moment. We remember when it was hot in the 2010s and also when it then dipped as well. So have seen both peaks and troughs and flat periods as well. So have been in the market for many years and bring that perspective today. One thing that's important to say about us, similar to the Carbon Trust, is we are a purpose-driven organisation. We like to define ourselves as a profit with purpose organisation. At our heart, what drives us is tackling climate change. What we know to do that is you have to have market-based solutions to do that if we're to hit the scale that we want to achieve. And we're very pleased, we can move on to the next slide. We measure our impacts not through our financial results, but through the impacts we deliver, both in carbon and in many other co-benefits. And this is just a summary of those benefits that we are important to us. And it's not just us that think that's important. We're very proud of the fact that we are, I think, the #1 rated B Corp in the UK as a profit with purpose company. So important to understand where we come from. In terms of today, in terms of the next slide, a couple of things I thought would be useful to cover. Really just talk about what I think we're all seeing, which is massive growth in the voluntary carbon market, to understand what's driving that, to understand what the impact and implications of that could be for corporates, and particularly talk about how that then feeds into the role of corporate leadership and leadership in net zero, and have a particular challenge to push back to the Carbon Trust about their third stage, about whether there should be a fourth stage, but we can certainly come on to that. If we start with the next slide, which is really just, I guess we all know the market is growing phenomenally. It's, 24 months ago, I remember talking to staff at Climate Care and at Natural Capital Partners, and everybody was saying, what do we need? And they said, well, what we really need is we need the market to grow. And we need to have, people take this more seriously. And I guess, I said to them, be careful what you wish for, because that is indeed what has happened. And the market has taken off in a very dramatic way, as it should do. And it should do because, as this chart shows, if you look at global emissions, very few, or a very tiny percentage of the emissions are covered through actions to try and do something about it in terms of carbon tax or compliance markets or the voluntary carbon markets, which is in proportion to total emissions is tiny. So there is a huge gap that we need to fill. 84% of emissions, global emissions, are not having effective action taken against them, and we need to really double up our actions on that. If we go to the next slide, we also know that, to hit our ambitions, we've got to actually cut emissions by, half by 2030. People talk about net zeros by 2040, 2050. The reality is, if we haven't made substantial progress by 2030, we'll be so far behind the curve that our ability to catch up will be almost impossible. And to give a perspective of that, what strikes me, that keeps me awake at night, is the realization that to cut emissions by nearly half by 2030 is equivalent to the current emissions of the US, Europe, India and China combined. We have to get those emissions out of the system in less than 10 years if we stand any chance to hit some of our ambitious targets. And when you think about that, it gets quite scary. And I'm, reasonably, here at COP, and of course we are all hoping for the best. But the reality is, most people know the work COP is done before they arrive here. Today, COP is usually about announcing things, but the work has already been done. And we know that if you add up all the NDCs, the nationally determined contributions that governments are making, that they don't go anywhere near to hitting the 1.5 degree target that we want to achieve. And in fact, they're just short of 3 degrees increase is what's likely to happen, even if they deliver those. And of course, that's a big if. As we know with governments, they'll say lots of wonderful things, but whether they will deliver them all remains to be seen. So there is, even if you take the most optimistic scenario and governments did everything they said they were going to do, we're still short. So there is, to me, governments are acting, but not enough, and not quickly enough, and not forcefully enough. It sounds a bit, I feel as I say, a bit like Chris Whitty and his COVID things, where he says you've got to go harder and quicker and more assertively than you think you need to go. And indeed, that is true here. But there is a real opportunity for corporates to step in and fill that gap. And I think that's where the voluntary carbon markets can really play an important role. I think Pauline was talking about increasing corporate action, and we did our own research with the Fortune 500, the global Fortune 500, and it was encouraging to see that there has been a 3-fold increase in net zero commitments from corporates from last year, and that's really exciting. But that only means, even with that increase, less than 40% of companies have a meaningful net zero target. That means 60% don't. So corporates are stepping up, and stepping up quicker than governments are stepping up, but the gap is still massive. So there's still plenty for us to work towards and to galvanize and catalyze corporate action. If we go on to the next thing, which is, we see this growth and we understand this growth is happening, but I think it's also important to understand what's driving it, because that also helps us respond to it. And to me, in terms of what's driving a lot of this, sudden surge in corporate action over the last 24 months, maybe a little bit further back, is 3 sort of underlying pressures or changes which have aligned to really make sure that corporates are saying, actually, we really do want to take this seriously. And some are at different ends of the spectrum. Some are doing it because they think, right, we've got to, the pressure's on us. Some are doing it because they generally see this as a massive challenge that they need to address. But it certainly helps that there are these massive pressures at play. Probably the most important one to me is consumer pressure. You can't help but pick up the papers even before COP about Blue Planet, Extinction Rebellion, Greta Thunberg, huge public understanding and outcry about the challenges of climate change. But what, of course, we've seen in recent times is that public opinion has changed into consumer pressure. So people are now making choices about products and services they buy based on the climate credentials of what they see in front of them. Now, that, of course, raises issues of integrity and rigor, which we need to keep tight on. But, of course, as soon as corporates realize that, if I'm going to buy, I don't know, a cup of coffee and one has a better climate credential than another, I'm going to choose that other, the climate credential one. Corporates immediately realize that this is not just the right thing to do, it's also good business. And much of the reaction to this is corporates realizing that this is the best thing to do for the planet, but it's also good business. And that consumer pressure, I think, is hugely important. So when people often talk about, as an individual, there's little I can do as an individual, I'm like, well, actually, I'm not sure that's true. There's plenty pressure can do as an individual consumer, which is now accumulating into stimulating corporate action. That's also combined with investor pressure. So they've got consumer pressure coming up from the bottom, and then they've got investor pressure coming down from the top. And it was interesting hearing Mark Carney, announce yesterday about the commitment of the financial service sector and asset managers, to redirect trillions of dollars into the green economy. And investors are doing that again for both the right reasons and self-interested reasons. They are terrified about having stranded assets. We have to remember many of these asset managers are pension funds, and they have a long-term horizon. They're not thinking about a return in the next 3 to 5 years. They're talking 20, 30 years. And they are terrified about getting caught with stranded assets, investing in, oil and gas, and suddenly find that they are stranded assets and their assets are no longer giving them returns. So it was very interesting seeing the impact Boris's announcement about banning combustion engines and the tick that's given to investment into EVs away from combustion engines. And that's the sort of stuff where investors are saying, actually, whatever we may think, it's too risky for us to continue to pile money into high carbon intensive businesses. And businesses are beginning to feel that pressure. They're finding if you are a high carbon intensive business, it's harder to get capital. It's harder to get it at attractive rates. And therefore capital is beginning to get redirected to areas that are supporting a decarbonized business model. And of course that again motivates businesses dramatically to change their behaviors and to adjust. And themselves, corporates are also changing their own attitudes. It used to be very much the domain of the CSR, ESG agenda for corporates, but now of course it's mainstream, seen as mainstream business, board level discussions, CEO agendas. And corporates are really taking a leadership role and saying, actually, we need to do something about this, and we're going to step forward and do it while governments work out how they want to operate. There's still much we can do. And that has created, to me, a really wonderful combination of aligned pressures that is driving a lot of this corporate action. Consumer pressure, investor pressure, and sort of peer group pressure amongst corporates themselves to make sure that they are responding effectively to the challenges they see ahead of them. And that's why many commentators, we can move on to the next slide, are putting a lot of focus on the voluntary carbon markets. It's not happening by chance. People aren't grabbing at straws. They see that a market-based approach that can scale dramatically has a real potential to have a massive impact on the gap we see in addressing climate change. That's why the task force on scaling the voluntary carbon market, Mark Carney's work, talked about scaling the voluntary carbon markets by 15-fold. They see a huge opportunity for the market to scale and deliver impact. And it's interesting, reading the NDC submissions at COP, the ones that people are discussing today here in Glasgow, 85% of those submissions in some way talk about wanting to use Article 6, which is the market mechanism, to deliver their targets. So without doubt, the voluntary carbon markets are playing and have the potential to play a huge contributive factor to help in closing the gap that we see in the shortfall of ambitions that governments are trying to deliver. So governments are doing what they can. We know it's going to be short. The voluntary carbon markets have an opportunity to help corporates really deliver that gap at scale. So to me, that was just a little bit of context about, we know the market's growing, we know there's a gap, we understand what's driving the growth in the market, we think, and we know there's a huge amount of interest to stimulate the growth in the voluntary carbon markets. But I also want to say a little bit about, move to the next slide, some of the implications of that growth. So, as my staff say to me, gosh, it's growing so fast, isn't that exciting? And it is exciting, but it does have some implications. And I wanted just to highlight some of those implications that we all need to be aware of as we all seek to accelerate and expand corporate action and the voluntary carbon markets. One of the impacts of this growing demand is, the market dynamics that we operate in have changed. So the market for many, many years was long, and it's now short. And by that, it was long in the sense that there was more supply than there was demand, and as a result, prices were seriously suppressed. You could buy carbon credits at a ridiculously low price, way below the true price of the project and way below the societal cost of carbon. Now that demand is going through the roof or growing very quickly, the market is kind of short, and therefore demand is outstripping supply. And of course, supply and demand, basic economics show that what's happening is prices going up, and prices going up quite rapidly. Now, for many people, they find that a little bit unnerving. They're like, oh gosh, prices are moving so quickly. I would say it's a good thing, actually. The price of carbon, the voluntary carbon market has done many, many good things. But the one thing it hasn't yet done is put the right price on carbon. And what this is doing is putting a much, prices are rising, so it's moving in the right direction. The voluntary carbon markets were set up in order to create a market mechanism which gave a price to an externality in order to change behaviors. And as that price goes up, I would say that is by and large a good thing. We are beginning to get closer to the real price of the externalities of carbon, and it will stimulate the market in a way that I think is altogether positive. But for many people, it gets them nervous because they've made these big commitments. They've assumed they can offset some of their residuals through carbon credits or verified emission reductions, and suddenly they see the price going up, and that causes, oh gosh, we've got this growing liability that we have to address. And my view is that's true, actually. That is exactly what we have, because that's what the market should be doing in terms of pricing carbon. But it's had a second impact on corporates, which we've seen, which again I think is a very positive one. So the first impact is prices going up. I would say that's not a bad thing. The second thing it's done is corporates are instinctively now moving into direct project development, because what they would normally do is they would make a commitment. They would, of course, do what they can to reduce and avoid themselves, and then they would try to offset their residual emissions through, we would hope, high-quality verified emission reduction programs. As they see the price of those rise, what many of them are doing is taking very sensible decisions to say, well, we don't want to be exposed to this price volatility and potential access. We may not even be able to get the projects we want. So what they are now doing is increasingly investing directly in projects themselves. So rather than buying source credits from existing projects, they're saying, no, actually, we want to invest our own money in projects so that we can own and have better connection with that project. And I would say that is also a good thing. I would say it's a good thing because what it means is corporates are getting connected with the underlying asset that sits within the voluntary carbon markets, which are the projects themselves. Too often we hear people talk about the mechanisms and the carbon credits and these things, but actually those are mechanisms. The underlying thing that drives our market is these fantastic projects around the world that are preventing forests from being cut down, that are distributing efficient cook stoves, and are delivering water filters to stop wood being cut down. These are the projects that actually are the underlying assets. And the impact of the price increase means that corporates are now saying, actually, we want to invest in those projects. And then they get more connected with the projects, these underlying assets, rather than the mechanism, which is a carbon credit or a price of carbon. So again, the growth, it causes some challenges, but I actually think it's pushing corporates in a altogether positive fashion to think more about directly funding projects or working in consortiums to directly fund projects. A third impact of this growth, as price goes up, invariably what happens is the fund managers or the hedge funds out there and suddenly see, gosh, this market's getting hot. Price is going up. It looks like it's going to keep going up for many, many years to come. So you then get a huge flow of new capital coming into the market. Now, again, on the face of it, you would say that's a good thing. That's a good thing because that's more money coming in to fund these great projects on the ground that are helping us to reduce carbon in the system. That's got to be a good thing. But as in all good things, if you have too much flowing in too quickly, it can inadvertently distort the market. It can mean that people are doing a rush to invest, which means that the risk of quality, whether people are really going to invest in high quality projects or just anything they can get their hands on. So there is a risk in my mind in this growth that this flow of new capital coming in, which of course is much welcomed, but we need to make sure it's well used and it's not just driven by speculation, but it is driven by a proper understanding of the underlying assets, these projects, and what they need to do to succeed over a long period of time, rather than just as a sort of hedge or as a speculative investment. So there's a sort of watch out for us there. Other watch outs for us as the market continues to grow, which I think everybody is probably aware of, is an increased call for transparency. I think, quite right, as this market takes off and more make these commitments and are using the voluntary carbon markets to make those commitments, people are wanting to make sure there is real scrutiny and transparency. And I would argue, to be honest, that the market does that very well. The verified emissions, these independent standard bodies, the double auditing that goes on, does that, I think, extremely well. And I would argue better than many other sectors. But, one of the things that people do ask for is better transparency on price. And there is a continual debate we have with this sort of what I would call the more sort of commoditized end of the market, where people want to see price transparency so that they can trade it efficiently on a screen, versus what I would call the people who are more focused on the underlying assets, which is where I would say our focus is. And I say that because arguing about the price, well, a lot of people say to me, well, we need to understand what the price of carbon is, and what is the price of carbon, and I always find it a difficult question to answer because it's like somebody saying to me, well, what's the price of a car? I want to buy a car. What's the price for a car? And I'm like, well, it depends on what car you want. If you want to buy a really small car, a little, Fiat 500, it's going to be reasonably cheap. But if you want to buy a really expensive Tesla, it's going to be quite expensive. And the same applies to the carbon market. So when people say what the price of carbon is, what they should be thinking of is the underlying asset, which is what is the cost of that project that I need to fund in order to get the credits or the verified emission reductions that I want. And clearly, if you're funding a grid scale renewable project in China, that's going to have massive economies of scale and therefore going to be relatively less expensive. But if you're funding a community-based project in northern Uganda, distributing cook stoves to remote areas at small scale, the unit cost is going to be significantly higher. And so to me, when we talk about the transparency, I always try to push away from transparency on price, not because I don't think that's a good thing, but actually what you want is transparency of funds flowing through to the projects, which are the underlying assets. So to me, I hear a lot of stuff in the press about, we need more transparency. And to me, sometimes that transparency is focused on the wrong thing, which is transparency of price, rather than transparency of flow of funds to those underlying projects. And then a couple of other ones just to sort of finish off in terms of impacts of this sort of rapidly growing sector. There are quite rightly huge amounts of technical debates going on that as this market grows, people want to make sure that it continues to have rigor and integrity, and that is quite right. And there are massive technical debates going on. I refer to amongst the sort of the carbon geek community about, what is the right way to do this? We have a debate at the moment about claims versus contributions, and these are important discussions to be had. But my caution on this is two. One is if we spend too much time talking about some of these differences, there is a real risk that the perfect becomes the devil of the good. And people think, well, should I do this or that? And in almost all cases, the answer is, do you know what? You should probably do both. It's not either or, it's both and. And we need to avoid in our desire to make sure we get this technically correct, which is a good desire, that we don't end up creating confusion, uncertainty in the market that inhibits people from acting. And we have to remember the main reason we're doing this is to encourage people to take action and to encourage them to take meaningful action. So let's make sure as we have those debates, which I think are much needed, that we don't inadvertently confuse and scare off the very people we are trying to encourage to take action as we go forward. And then the final thing, I would say in terms of what's the impact of this growing demand on the sector is what we're already seeing is, corporates asking for impacts beyond carbon. So carbon has always been the sort of fungible instrument, the instrument that carries the cost of a project. But actually what increasingly people are saying is, I want carbon, but actually, I'm actually also interested in plastics or biodiversity, and I want to have fun things that deliver outcomes or impacts in that area as well. So what I hope will also happen is we will see as the market continues to grow, which I hope it will, and I'm sure it will, that actually we will be spreading our wings beyond just carbon to a whole host of SDGs and other co-benefits that I think corporates are finding particularly important for their own business. And they are different for different businesses, but I think that again is a good thing. So for me, just to sort of recap, we see the need for growth. The market is growing very quickly. There are a whole series of impacts which I think we need to be mindful of as we try to ride this fast growth market, most of which I think are hugely positive. This is positive stuff that people are wanting to do more, prices are going up, funds are flowing in, but it does bring risks which we need to make sure we keep focused on, and let's keep focused on the underlying asset, which are the projects that underlie or underpin what we do. And if we focus on that and don't get too distracted, sometimes just on the mechanism, I think we will probably end ourselves in a very good place. And finally, I just wanted to say a few words about leadership. I was very interested in hearing the Carbon Trust's new 3-stage sort of accreditation process. I thought, kudos to you guys. That looks exactly right to me. But just a couple of thoughts, final thoughts, so we can move on to the last couple of slides, just to round off with. I mean, this slide, I think, just reiterates, I hope, the point to make, so we can probably skip over this one, which is just to say, as the market grows, let's not forget focus on quality. You know, if we don't focus on the underlying projects and the underlying assets, you know, the whole thing we're trying to build will lose credibility. So, you know, yes, it is fast growing, exciting, but it's really important we keep focus on the quality of the markets and of the underlying assets as we go forward. And I would encourage all corporates who are taking action to that, not just to think about, you know, the offset programs, but actually the underlying projects as they do that. But my challenge to the Carbon Trust is actually, you know, what is leadership now? So we used to quite happily talk about, you know, getting to net zero. That is leadership. Actually, we think leadership may move beyond net zero and get us into net positive, or I can never work out what the right terminology is. But if we agree that, you know, that government action, the NDCs, are not going to close the gap to the 1.5, and that the corporates can step in and close much of that gap, actually what they need to do to deliver leadership is not only compensate and for their own emissions and reduce their own emissions and then compensate for the residuals, but they probably need to go beyond that to help close the gap that others are not there to meet, are not being able to address. And so in the past, we would have agreed that net zero is leadership. I think what we're now saying to our clients is net zero is responsible. You're being a responsible leader if you do net zero. If you want to be leadership, you've got to go beyond that. You've got to be thinking about net positive and actually covering all of your emissions and also more, so that you're contributing to the gap that we know now exists, that we all have a responsibility to deliver. And if you have the capability to do that, which some of the big corporates do, then we would encourage corporates to think about that. And I think that may reframe how we think about net zero leadership in the corporate sector. So that's my sort of challenge for what it's worth back to the Carbon Trust. And on the last couple of slides, if I can just quickly finish off, you know, that there was a lot of discussions where people asked us to say a little bit about, you know, the balance between removals in our market. You know, the hot topic at the moment, if you talk to any corporate about what do they want, they always say we want removals. We want removals projects. And of course, those are important. You know, they fit obviously with the SBTI, and they are important. But again, let's not get overly obsessed with those. I think we need to make sure we get proper balance. The reality is there won't be enough removal projects, or certainly not nature-based removal projects, in order to meet all the commitments corporates are making. If you add them up and think through how many projects, there's probably just not enough land mass to deliver the nature-based solution removal projects that corporates want. So while it is a very hot topic at the moment, and that's where everybody wants to go, the reality is we have to remind people that both removals and avoidance are both good things. Again, it's not, we tend to always polarize our arguments into either or rather than both and. That yes, we do need to plant trees, that's a good thing. But we also need to make sure we're not destroying existing standing forests, which is an avoidance project. Both are good. And we need to do both in unison rather than just get ourselves overly obsessed at just saying it's got to be removals. And some of the standards, I think, tend to drag people down that route. They think that's the safest route to go. The reality is we would always argue if corporates are taking a long-term commitment, they need to think about having a balanced portfolio of removal and avoidance projects if they're going to meet their net zero programs. And in terms of what corporates are trying to do, this is the sort of standard sort of pathway that we would expect all corporates to do, which is, you know, they would be reducing their own emissions, which are the red line at the top. They would be taking full responsibility for the emissions as they reduce their emissions using offsets, and they would be moving to, for the residual emissions, moving to biological or nature-based removal emissions towards the end so that they can legitimately get to net zero. What I think we will see in this chart is some people going beyond net zero to net positive. I'm not sure if that's a double negative or not, but so we're trying to get people to think about actually, should we go beyond this and create a new form of market leadership for corporates? But the final thing I'd want to say just by sort of conclusion is, you know, we know we have this big gap. We know governments are going to be slow to respond, and therefore there is an opportunity for the corporate sector and the voluntary carbon market to step in and fill that gap. We can see what's driving that, and we think that is largely a good thing. We need to guard against, quality being reduced and too much of a fast and unintelligent growth. But by and large, we think there is huge opportunity. And what we would say is, if we are thinking about how do we, address the challenges we've got to face, it's clear to me that a market-based solution has to be part of the answer. Governments can act and governments can force people to do stuff, but a market-based solution is what we need, I think, to release the trillions of dollars, not just the billions of dollars, that we need to release in order to tackle the climate change challenge that we face. And I think, for me, the voluntary carbon markets plays a hugely powerful and important role in doing that. But we need to make sure we do that with our eyes wide open, understanding the complexities and keeping focused on the underlying asset that drives these markets, which are these wonderful projects across the world, delivering carbon reduction in some of the most difficult situations. Those are the things that we should be focused on, and making sure that we're funding as we take all our corporates on the journey towards net zero. Tiff, I will stop there. I've probably spoken far too long. Apologies for that. But I hope that is helpful in some way, and happy to take questions or comments from people if that's helpful.
Thank you so much, Vaughan. Very interesting to hear about all those aligned pressures, consumer, investor, direction of finance, and how this is all kind of resulting in that sweet spot of what's good for the planet is also good for business, which is, of course, what we've all been working for. Yes. And also great to hear how the voluntary carbon market can help to bridge the gap which exists today in terms of emissions reductions globally through the use of quality projects, both combining carbon avoidance and carbon removals as part of today's corporate strategies. We are now going to move on to our panel discussion, which is going to be led by the Carbon Trust, Dominic Burbridge, Director of Sales in the Business Services team. Our panelists today include Paul Irwin-Rhodes from retailer Greggs, David Fitzgerald from the food and drinks company Kellogg Group, and Rose Sandel from the home builder Redrow Homes Limited. So during this panel, we'll discuss the practical aspects of setting net zero targets and setting out our reduction pathways. And just before we move on to that, I just want to remind everyone on the call today that if you could please change your names to your actual names on Zoom so that we can allocate you to the correct breakout rooms at 11. That would be really helpful. Thank you. And over to you, Dom.
Brilliant. Thanks, Tiff. And good morning, everybody. So for those of you who don't know me, my name is Dom Burbridge. I'm a director of the Carbon Trust. I've been working with some of you here for probably more than 10 years. As early adopters, leading the way and very much turning good environmental performance into competitive advantage, and obviously inspiring others to follow you. I guess in many ways we know what we need to do, but we're all at different starting points along that journey to net zero. We know that we want to be a part of the solution and not the problem for climate change. And we very much know we've got to avoid greenwash. So really the aim of today's session is we're going to cover the topic of net zero target setting and reduction pathways and putting it into practice. And of course, the most efficient way to learn is very much to talk to your peers, speak to your peers, and this is the opportunity today. So representing a broad range of sectors from food and drink and agriculture and high street, all the way through to the built environment and house building. I'd very much now like to welcome my three guests today. We've got Rose and Dave and Paul, and to thank them for joining this morning's session. Now, they're here to answer your questions. The key things are really around kind of your questions about where are they on their net zero journey and what have they learned on the way. As we know, everybody's at a different stage. And so this is your chance to ask your questions. So if you could type them into the Q&A box, any questions that you have, then anybody who's also joining, you can upvote those, give them a thumbs up, and then we will pick out those questions that are most relevant and most of interest. When you're writing a question, if you want to direct it at a particular person, obviously please just add their name, and that will make it easier for us as well. So to get things started, I'm going to turn to each of our panelists, and if you could just take a moment or two just to introduce yourselves, your name, company, the role, that would be great. And then I'll move on to my first question before opening it up. So from my left, I'll start with Paul, and then Dave, and then Rose. So Paul.
Hi everybody, I'm Paul Owen-Rhodes. I'm the Head of Sustainability and Safety, Health and Environment for Greggs. I've been with the business 20 years, so regulatory law was my key focus, and then what evolved from environmental legal compliance turned into social responsibility, and then turned into sustainability, which is where it is now. Dom, did you say just a little bit about where we are on our journey as well?
Not yet, just a good intro into yourself. I'll just go over to Dave now, and then we'll come back to that, if that's okay, Paul. Thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah, thanks, Dom. Good morning. So I lead responsible sourcing for Kellogg Company in Europe. So I work in the procurement function. So Kellogg, as you know, are a global cereal and snacks company. We've been in the UK for, I think the Manchester factory was built in 1938. So we've a long history in the UK and in Europe. With a number of plants around Europe producing cereals, and Pringles as well, which is one of our other big brands. So I look after working with our supply chain broadly on reducing carbon emissions to achieve our targets.
Amazing, thanks, Dave. And Rose.
Hi, thanks, Dom. I'm Rose Sandow. I'm the Group Communities Director at Redrow Homes. I've had the honour of working for Redrow for 11 years. I've got a public sector background, so Redrow Homes, private developer, so we are the built environment. I sit on exec, and under me I have a number of departments, including sustainability and master planning. So I like to think that I bring together a real ESG lead role within the company, and spearhead that for us. Yeah, I'm really pleased to be here today. Thank you, Dom.
Brilliant, thanks, Rose. Great, well look, let's kick things off. So my first question is obviously really very much about, so this will be to all of you, so very much in high level terms, maybe a couple of bullet points. Can you describe where you are on where your organization is on your net zero journey? So I'll start with Dave, and then we'll go to Rose, and then Paul. So Dave.
Sure. So Kellogg's, I suppose a significant milestone for us was we set science-based targets back in 2015. So we were one of the, I suppose, early adopters of science-based targets. And that was in line with a 2-degree keeping temperature rise within 2 degrees. And, you know, in line with that, we obviously measured our baseline, our scope 1, 2, and 3 baseline, and have been making significant progress, particularly on scope 1 and 2, as many businesses have, in terms of sourcing renewable electricity. So in Europe, we've reduced our scope 1 and 2 by almost 30% at this stage, based on our 2015 baseline. On scope 3, we had been doing a lot of work of engaging our supply chain just to understand and measure carbon emissions. So using platforms like CDP, and through our sort of supplier engagement processes, gathering a lot of data and understanding our emissions. And in the last 12 months, you know, in line with, I suppose, improved accounting standards, we've refreshed our scope 3 baseline and measurement. Actually, we used the Carbon Trust to do that work. And we now have a very up-to-date, clear baseline on our scope 3 emissions. So we have targets to 2030 in terms of reducing scope 3 emissions by 15%, and then out to 2050 by 50%. So we're now developing our planning around that, and also looking at the new SBTi net zero standard in line with the 1.5 degree temperature. So that's where we are currently within our own business.
Amazing, thanks, Dave. And Rose, where are you?
Well, we've been making a steady reduction on our greenhouse gas emissions over the last few years, but we made in the summer our commitment to SBTi 1.5, which I was really pleased about, which was ratified by our board and fully supportive. So I would say, in all honesty, we're quite an early part of our journey. So we're working with yourselves in actually looking at our scope 1, scope 2 and scope 3. And we really appreciate that actually the majority of the work that we're going to be doing, a huge amount of it is on our scope 3. So we're at a really early stage, Dom, really early stage.
That's great. And Paul, how about you?
Yeah, so very similar. So we've been working on our scope 1 and 2 for around about the last 10 years, working very closely with the Carbon Trust on that. So all of our low-hanging fruit has been picked. In terms of 1 and 2, we've got a couple of areas we're now focusing on. From a scope 3 point of view, we completed our scope 3 analysis this year. And then we're in the process of setting science-based targets aligned with 1.5 degrees. We've confirmed our net zero dates across all 3 scopes, 2030 for scope 2, 35 for scope 1, and 2040 for scope 3, aligned with the British Retail Consortium's climate roadmap. So we're at a bit of an early stage in terms of the scope 3, so supplier engagement is a key piece of our planning for next year. And then from a scope 1 and 2 point of view, we're grasping the nettle now around things such as logistics and gas usage within our manufacturing sites.
Amazing, brilliant. Yeah, so I think so. We're getting some questions through from the floor, and the biggest question at the moment is, what advice do you have for businesses that are right or are just beginning their journey to net zero? So I guess that's, you know, a lot of you have won the board support, you've got the commitment to set your targets and implement targets. How did you get there? What's your advice to somebody who hasn't really started? So maybe I'll go again, start with Dave and then Rose and then Paul.
Sure. So yeah, it can be quite a daunting area when you're starting out. I've worked in corporate sustainability for about 15 years and in the food and drink sector for 20, and I've seen this evolve over that time. And I think, you know, understanding, you know, how you measure emissions is really a key starting point. So, you know, understanding the greenhouse gas protocol, you know, how you measure scope 1 and 2, you know, and 3 now as well, and being very clear on that data. And it needs to be data driven. You know, a lot of the conversations initially in businesses were focused on, you know, things that could be done and maybe a little bit more on the narrative rather than on the data. I think it's now firmly about the data, and the narrative follows from that. So for me, that's a key starting point, understanding your data.
Amazing. Thanks, David. And Rose, how about you?
Yeah, I think you can't underestimate how much you need that buy-in within the company. There's no point embarking on a mission, be it a personal mission or whether you want to be that responsible business, if you don't have the support of the board, if you don't have the support of your non-exec, there's just no point. So when we were doing this, it was something that actually the board wanted to do. And it was something that our non-exec absolutely wanted us to be doing. And I think that we had been doing some good work over the last few years, but we'd certainly been sort of tinkering around the edges, and we'd been doing quite a lot of R&D on scope 1 and scope 2, but actually we weren't really doing a huge amount with that R&D afterwards. So I think where we are now is actually we understand that we've actually got that commitment that's made, and that actually we've now got to turn in that R&D into actually implementation and start to look at that for results to actually help us improve where we're going.
No, absolutely, that makes sense. And I think getting that board level buy-in is essential, because this is, whilst this will be led by sustainability, this is a challenge for the whole business that is ultimately going to require business model innovation, and that isn't going to happen if you haven't got the board behind you. Brilliant, thanks, Rose. And Paul, what would be your learnings that you'd pass on for somebody who's just starting on this journey?
Yeah, I think there's a couple of pieces really in terms of the first bit about gaining that buy-in. I think there's something very much around simplifying what this means. I always think carbon's quite an ethereal subject. So for probably the majority of people who are sitting on this call, we understand it, but I'm sure it didn't. It's you get a bit of a light bulb moment where all of a sudden you say, yeah, I really get that. But trying to do that with your board and then your senior teams, where it's not their day job is difficult. So trying to simplify it and trying to bring it to life, I think, is really, really important. Following on from Dave's point, I think you're right in terms of it needs to be data driven, and to support that, I think you need to find a good partner to help you on that data journey. So you have that verification that you're moving in the right direction. And then the third bit again is, I suppose, is a little bit about buy-in, or how it worked for me is I used our risks and opportunities as a way of demonstrating what we could gain as an organization from moving down this pathway, and also what we could lose if we didn't move down that pathway, and it worked very well.
Yeah, no, absolutely. No, that's really great. I think we're getting quite a few questions about the inevitable side of things, which is around where your scope 3 hotspots are. So for a lot of organizations, actually that's going to be with your supply chain. So we've had a couple of questions around, do the panelists have any recommendations on how businesses can effectively support SME suppliers? So I think this is the role that you can have in bringing your supply chain with you, and acting in leadership. So maybe Paul, could I start with you, and then I'll go to Rose and then Dave. So,
yeah, not a problem. So really, yeah, you're right. The scope 3 one is a huge number.
Yeah.
And as you can imagine, so we have a sizable amount of our product range is based on meat protein. So there are hotspots. And we're in the very early stages of developing our framework for how we're going to work with our supply chain in terms of tackling climate change. For some of our biggest suppliers, it's great because they're already on the journey.
Yeah.
But for some of our SMEs, so our smaller suppliers from across the UK and wider, this is new news to them. We try to work very closely with our supply chain as partners to the organisation. We don't just purchase off them; we work very closely with them. So the framework we're building is that engagement plan of what we can do to bring them up to speed and demonstrate how we need them to come on board with us. To also share our knowledge and our experience, so they can utilise that as one big Greg supply chain partnership.
Amazing. How are you finding? Do you find, is there a good awareness amongst your suppliers, or we see a real mix. So from the majority of our larger suppliers, as you would expect, they're getting pressure from their stakeholders, so they've started their journey. For some of our smaller SMEs, this is complete new news to them. They haven't really considered this would affect them. So we're starting at it's at the start of discussions. It's a carbon cycle we're generally starting with. But then we have a number of SMEs where personally, small organizations, where they have a personal willingness to drive reduction in climate change. So they're much easier to get on board and much more happier to innovate and work closely with you. Amazing. And how did you get your procurement team on board, or have you got to that stage, and what's their level of, I guess, interest and awareness of this issue?
Yeah, I mean, so we're quite lucky. We're a purpose-led organisation, so sustainability in whatever guise it was before permeates through the organisation, and I promise you that's not greenwash. So our procurement team were all really on board with that as part of our purpose. They're now taking on more of the mantle in terms of that working closely with suppliers and taking that away from the sustainability team. We've given them some understanding about the key things we're focusing on.
Amazing, thanks, Paul. And so Rose, how about you? And you'll have thousands of suppliers. How are you engaging with them? What's their awareness like?
Well, I'm pleased to say that actually we've got a really good, strong working relationship with our procurement department and also with our technical departments. And we have a divisional structure that sits under that, and there is a lot of conversation that goes on between us all, which is great. We have strengthened our supplier appraisal process so that we have now included questions and given people the opportunity to probe back to us on what we are doing and what they are doing. So that's really started to strengthen, and we put out a note to our suppliers when we've made our SBTI commitment in the summer, and we got a fantastic response rate back, which I was really quite surprised at, and that came back quite quickly. There is still a gap with those that are way behind the curve, but I think there's real opportunity for us to work with our supply chain. But we, like Paul, are in that early stages. But actually I took quite a lot of comfort from knowing that actually people understood what we were saying and they were interested, and we started to find creeping out of the woodwork but from my point of view, sort of our colleagues that work for our supply chain, they have got somebody who works in sustainability, or they have got someone who's actually interested in how we can help them deliver their scope 3 and their other scope objectives as well. So yeah, it's really positive.
Yeah, but I think it's so true. We're all in it together, and if we're going to drive the innovation that's going to be required to actually decarbonize our scope 3, our supply chain, we can't do it alone, and you're going to rely on the innovation that's coming up from the ground up, and being open to that. And it is going to be a challenge because it's going to have to rethink about how we actually structure the products and services that we provide. So it's amazing.
I think a challenge for us will be our subcontractors, so the people that build our homes, and I think that they will be probably less as far advanced on their journey with this, if any advancement at all. So I think there's going to have to a really big education piece from us to them on what we are trying to do and why we're trying to do that as well.
Exactly. I think some industries are more traditional than others, and the method, and often the message is, if it isn't broken, don't fix it, and they're just not aware that there's this problem that we're trying to solve. So that is definitely the challenge. Brilliant. Thank you, Rose. Dave, what's your perspective on this, engaging with the SME suppliers?
Yeah, this is a really interesting one for us. So, I mean, we have from a procurement perspective, obviously a supplier segmentation, a proper process to, how we work with suppliers in terms of strategic or other categories of suppliers. More and more, we've been building sustainability into that particular model. And the scope 3 work we did in the last 12 months has helped us, take a sort of prioritized risk-based approach to this. So, we have thousands of suppliers, and obviously we can't work with every supplier on every aspect. So we need to prioritize, and we need to look at the hotspots. So we're looking at, for us, commodities like rice, for example, oils, vegetable oils, packaging materials as well. And we're looking then at our strategic suppliers, and obviously the tool we've built now helps us break down our emissions by category, but also by supplier. So then we can start to look strategically and say, well, which of these suppliers do we need to work with to deliver the reductions that we need? Where are they in terms of their sustainability maturity? Some, as Paul has said, some are well advanced in this. Some have science-based targets, some of our suppliers. Others don't even measure carbon emissions. So what approach do we take to those suppliers? How do we identify gaps versus what we're trying to achieve? And then how do we work with those suppliers to build their capability, their understanding, and their programs to help us meet those gaps? And to the point that was mentioned earlier as well, that Rose touched on in terms of the other tiers in your supply chain, for us, agriculture is where the challenge is. It's not actually our tier 1 suppliers that, the companies that process the rice, they're relatively small in terms of the emissions in our value chain. The emissions are at the growing stage. So how are we working with our suppliers to work with their growers, typically to reduce carbon emissions in agriculture, in our agricultural supply chain? So this is a real area of focus for us as well.
Yeah, I think you touched on a really interesting point, which I think is coming through really strong, which is data driven. So you're using data to prioritize on what matters most, so as to direct your efforts, because you can't do everything with everyone. I think the second thing, and it's really always worth emphasizing, is that where there's carbon, there's cost, and then where there's carbon, there's risk. And again, so this is the business benefit of that sort of supplier engagement, is how do you reach into your supply chain to basically de-risk and remove inflationary cost pressures that, as we transition to a low carbon economy, will probably be more keenly felt by businesses. So brilliant. Thanks, Dave. I've had some really practical questions as well, which is all around how sort of how big is your sustainability team? How do you secure the funding to fund it? Have you got any top tips in that area? In other words, how do you build the sustainability function so that it can do more, I guess, ultimately with less? So maybe Rose, I'll start with you, and then I'll go to Paul and then Dave.
I'd love a bigger team, Dom. I think sometimes what you need to do is not only look at your own department, but look at the skills that you have within the company. And actually, we've got some people that work within Redrow who are really interested in this topic as well. So, take the procurement team, take our group technical team. We've got skills within those departments and can help us look at what we are doing and how we're going to get there as well. And you can't just look within those teams. You need to look within your financial teams as well and your governance teams, and you will find somebody who actually is really committed to doing and helping you deliver it. So, and if you're going to make these things work, it goes back to the point you were making, Dom. It's actually, it may be branded in that kind of, it's a sustainability initiative, but actually, this is about business opportunity, business growth, dealing with risk for us all. So, it is something that needs to be delivered by the whole company. To answer your question about how many people I have in my department explicitly, I have a head of department and I have 2 senior people, 2 managers and 1 grad. So we're not particularly big, but I'd like maybe 1 or 2 others if I could.
Brilliant. Thanks, Paul.
I'm going to repeat what Rose said. I would always like people. Yeah. So we're relatively small. So I have a corporate affairs director who acts as our lead on sustainability. From a strategic point of view, then there's myself, I have an environmental manager, a supporting sustainability manager, and then some low-level sort of admin support around that, with another sustainability manager coming on board early next year. The good thing we have is I have a team of mavericks from across the business. So people who are decision makers and who are doers, who are really embedded in delivering against our sustainability goals. So across all of the functions, so whether it's in finance, manufacturing ops, logistics, and procurement, I've got 2 or 3 people who come together on a regular basis, formally or informally, to help drive the message.
Yeah, amazing. How do you prioritize their sort of actions? Because I think what we're finding is that the pace of change now is so fast. It's kind of, do you have a process for how you focus your efforts?
So we have a materiality process that we use as part of our ESG report, or our ESG strategy.
Yeah.
Which helps focus, I suppose the key priorities from a strategic point of view. But you're right, in terms of day-to-day life, things are changing on a fairly regular basis. It's about having that network, and then between us agreeing, right, what's the key thing that we can put to one side at the moment, and we can pick up that new priority. It's relatively informal.
Yeah. No, absolutely. Sounds like you have to be quite fleet of foot, and having a close-knit team really helps. And Dave, how are things organised with Kellogg's?
Yeah, I think you'll find it's a common refrain that sustainability is not as well resourced as it needs to be, but I think that's changing as well. And I think it comes back to an earlier point about, at the exec level, at the board level, how sustainability is prioritized. And I mean, we're seeing a huge push commercially. Our customers, our consumers are demanding more on sustainability. And that's driving, I think, a different conversation now in our business. So, we're seeing it's led from a corporate globally from a corporate comms perspective. So we have a global sustainability team based in the US, where our global headquarters is. They set the strategy and the programs around our main pillars: climate change, human rights, and other aspects as well. And then regionally, we have within our manufacturing, typically within the EHS function, we have a lead for carbon emissions reduction, water, waste reduction, and then responsible sourcing, which is me. So within each of our 4 regions, we would have a team for each of those aspects. So that's how we're structured. I think the challenge now is finding that balance. And I noticed in some of the comments around the technical aspects of sustainability, I think there traditionally has been a focus on the the narrative aspects, so the corporate comms being the lead, tend to drive we need to, tell the story of what we're doing, but actually maybe not understand the technical challenges of how that's delivered within the business. And I think more and more people are realizing, and businesses are realizing, you need those technical specialists, people who understand carbon accounting and climate change, people who understand human rights, and people who can deliver on those within the business. And you need to join the dots between the sort of corporate piece and the actual delivery on the ground as well. So I think that's a change you're seeing more and more now in businesses as well.
Well, that's fantastic. I mean, I've got two more questions, and I'm going to pick up on that point, which is around that the time is for action, and the time is and that needs experts who actually really understand the nitty-gritty grassroots of what actually needs to be done, and then them to be able to communicate that in a sufficiently robust way so as to secure the investment and drive that change. So we'll pick up on that in a minute. But I've had one question, which was actually for Rose, for house building. And it was all around basically adoption of modern methods of construction. Why are we still building with bricks and blocks when we could be moving to much lower carbon solutions such as timber frame and things like that. But so I'll ask Rose that question, but I'm going to also broaden it out for the other Paul and Dave, this is around business model innovation. Businesses obviously exist on the products and services that they currently sell. How alive is your business to actually thinking about new markets, new low carbon solutions for low carbon living? So I'll come back to you and ask you those sort of questions. But Rose, maybe you can just talk a bit about from the house building perspective.
Yeah, it's a good question, and actually we're perhaps much more of a traditional house builder than some of our peer group. We tend to build a slightly larger house, a house with a lot more detail. It's not such a box, it's not such a square shape. And that has traditionally held us back from adopting some more strategic modern methods of construction. But it is something that we are looking at now. And I would say that's not always just driven by the carbon agenda. A lot of that is driven by the availability and the distortion we've seen with materials. Some of it is about actually a change in product design. So maybe we've got product design actually that suits those construction methods a bit more. And actually how the business is evolving. It's certainly something that we are adopting. I think with modern methods of constructions, I think it's important not to think about it in just this sort of the big headline stuff, which is, pods and big timber frames. Actually, you can use components within houses that can actually make a difference, on the waste that you're producing in that house as well. So actually that makes, it's a business opportunity for you there, because you might speed up your construction and you also make less waste. I think the ambition and the real challenge for us is actually how do we build a Redrow future home that actually looks and is the same, because we know that's what our customer likes, but actually is zero carbon ready, is that the build is much more, is a much higher quality, because maybe you're taking out some of the potential defects that you've got coming forward as well. But also we're doing a lot of R&D on getting ourselves ready for 2025, which is a future home standard. And the challenge for us there is ensuring that we have the supply chain ready to help us meet that demand as well. And also for us is the big part is actually is the behavioural change that will need to come from customers as they adopt with that as well. So new methods of heating homes is going to be a very big change from moving from fossil fuel to air source heat pumps or smart homes, be them through PVs and batteries. And we've got some R&D that's going on that at the moment, which is really quite exciting. But a big focus on that, which I have to remind everybody again and again, is how is the customer going to adapt to this? How is the customer going to feel about it? And I think I'm one for getting our hands dirty on this, and kind of saying, look, this is a piece of R&D. It's not going to be perfect, but that's the whole point of R&D, is learning from that and giving ourselves the opportunity so that we can really, perhaps from my point of view, get ourselves ahead of the rest of the group, so that we can have that product that's there and give us perhaps the ability to sell our homes quicker, so that there's even more of a reason for somebody to come and buy our home rather than one of our peer group homes. So that's the real drive for us with it.
Amazing. I love the link of that sort of business model innovation to obviously quality, and it's all about, you know, delivering quality to your customers. And I think you've hit on a really good point, which is that if you're going to change your business model, you need to take your customers and your supply chain with you. What's been your perspective, Paul, on sort of have you got the opportunity to transform?
We have, and we're a frontline retailer, so we are at the customer's behest, if you want, because they're always there. So we watch what the market's doing, and we watch what's coming through from a policy point of view, from government, and what's coming through from NGOs, and we shape our business accordingly. So we look for those opportunities that come along with that. A prime example, and I haven't referenced this in a talk for over 2 years, so I feel like I'm being there's a bit of reminiscing here. Sausage roll. If you'd spoken to Greggs customers or within Greggs 10 years ago and said we would have a vegan, a non-meat sausage roll, I think they would have been, they would have been amazed. But on the back of that, we saw what the customer uptake was in that. And then we've developed our range further, and then we have a plan within our sustainability strategy to increase that even further. So we're seeing that innovation. And the good thing is with this innovation is we tried it and it worked. So we've got a method and a model, and we know customers want it, and we speak to our customers on a regular basis. So we can see it's less of a risk developing that approach and changing that business strategy between now and 2030, 2035. We get some additional benefits from that as well. So we get some carbon benefits, but we really ahead of the game, and we become sort of the go-to place for that vegan product.
Yeah, no, I think it's really interesting, and we're seeing that there is that, the appetite for low carbon living, and people looking to corporates to provide solutions that fit with their lifestyle choices. And I think that that's great, because where there's a market, it makes it much easier for businesses to innovate and move into that space. What's been your perspective, Dave? Is business model innovation an opportunity for Kellogg's?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think, there's a couple of examples. So we're largely a plant-based company, Kellogg. That's something certainly we've been talking a lot more about, I think, in the last number of years. We've through some of our existing lines, so we've looked at on-pack labeling and claims around some of the work we've been doing. So, for example, on cornflakes, Kellogg's cornflakes, we have a responsible sourcing claim, which talks about practices at farm level that are, help reduce carbon emissions and mitigate the effects of climate change. So, we're seeing that from a sort of a product and brand level. And I think, the whole eco-labeling space is really, really interesting now, and this is evolving really, really fast. And nutritional labeling obviously is now common. It's, across foods you buy, but eco-labeling is only really an emerging space. So, our business is looking very closely at this, and what the opportunities are to tell the stories. But then also looking at, and just briefly to touch on the agricultural supply chain, we have done a lot of work investing in sustainable agriculture projects in Europe. So we invest with wheat growers in the UK, for example, and we also invest in rice growing in Spain, helping farmers trial and develop management practices that reduce carbon emissions and the impacts of climate change. And those types of projects are becoming more and more important. The challenge for us now, and I think for a lot of the industry, is how do we scale this approach? So we have solutions. We know we can reduce greenhouse gas emissions in rice growing, for example, by up to 45% using certain management practices. But we need to convince the farmers that, there's a risk there. How do we share the risk in that in terms of, the farmer's income and all of those aspects? So there's a lot more to be done collaboratively with others who are sourcing rice and the other commodities that we source as well, to help support farmers, because we can't do it on our own. It's just, farmers grow lots of different crops, and Kellogg just trying to push our particular agenda is not going to result in the change. So we need to work with others to support farmers to deliver this change.
No, amazing. No, that's really important. So we've almost out of time. I was going to ask another question, which was all about, the really key point that has been asked a lot, has been mentioned a lot, which is about data. And I think the antidote to greenwash is good data, because if you've got good data and you can demonstrate real reductions, then you really are part of the solution and not the problem. So I was going to touch on that, but unfortunately we've run out of time, but I just wanted to emphasize that. So my last question, just to the panel, is really, in a sentence, what advice have you got to your peers on really how to succeed in a net zero transition? So if you were just talking them one-to-one, what advice would you give them? I'll start with Rose, and then Dave, and then Paul.
I think it's at the risk of repeating myself. You need your main board and exec support, because without that vision of where they want to go, and they might not know how they want to get there, but they need that vision of where they want to be as a business. Where do they see themselves as the future, and what do they want to achieve? And then it's up to you to work out how you're going to do that and how you're going to bring your business along. But without that, it's kind of pointless.
Brilliant, thanks, Rose. Dave?
Yeah, I think sort of aligned to that. I think understanding the risks and opportunities for your business is really, really important. So Paul mentioned materiality, and understanding, where the market is going to move. So for us, it's clear that customers and consumers want, more climate friendly products. They want measurable and verifiable claims that support that. So that's a commercial opportunity for our business, but there's also a risk there. Has the risk of driving costs within our supply chain. We've lots of risk around continuity of supply for certain commodities, that are affected by climate change and flooding and drought and all of these aspects as well. So be really clear on what the risks and opportunities are for your business. And this helps drive your business case with your exec and with others, because ultimately this is coming whether you like it or not. And it's how far along you are in terms of, have you really shown leadership and really gotten on the journey. So I think that's really, really important.
Amazing, thanks Dave. Yeah, and the TCFD framework is great for trying to help you bubble up those risks and opportunities that are most material for your business. And Paul, what would your advice be?
Well, really, I'm going to paraphrase both Rose and Dave on this one. So in terms of that board buy-in, I think you're right. That's really, really important. And to reference what I said at the very start, keeping that simple. So using the data to drive some of the understanding, but trying to keep that sort of model as simple as possible for non-practitioners, I think is very important. From an internal point of view, it's collaborating and getting on board those other decision makers, those operational decision makers within the business, and seeing the opportunities that you can get from that in the not maybe in the short term, but in that longer term. And then I think there's a transparency piece as well. This isn't easy, what we're all trying to do. And there is a risk of greenwashing, and all of your stakeholders not understanding how difficult some of this transition is. So I think there's something very key about saying, right, we've done the easy stuff, we're now on to the really hard stuff, and we need everybody to be on board with that.
Amazing, absolutely. Well, thank you so much. I mean, that sort of draws to an end this session. Obviously, thank you to the three of you for your answering questions so well, and thank you also to our audience who came up with some very good and searching questions. Hopefully, this has been a useful exercise, and thank you very much. I'll hand back to Tiff.
Thank you so much, Dom. So we are now going to take a short coffee or tea break, and we'll see you back in 15 minutes at 11:15 for the sector breakout sessions, which are being led by our Carbon Trust sector leads. So just as a reminder, the sectors breakouts that we are having are for the agricultural, food and drink sector, construction, infrastructure and property, finance sector, the retail sector, pharmaceuticals and ICT. So there should be something for everyone. If you could please remember to change your name so that we can allocate you to the correct sector group, that would be great. And just as a reminder, we do still have our Slido poll open for voting. So don't forget to vote on there. See you back at 15:15. Welcome back, everyone. I hope that you had a nice break and that you're excited for our next session, in which we're going to be exploring the kind of challenges and opportunities that different sectors face in aligning with net zero, with breakout sessions being led by our sector leads at the Carbon Trust. But before then, please join me in welcoming Hélène, who is one of our directors at the Carbon Trust, who is Director of Proposition Architecture, and will, in a first instance, take us through the main concepts and pathways to net zero, before we then go out into the breakout sessions. So without further ado, over to you, Hélène.
Thank you very much, Tiff. Hello, everyone. I hope you've been having a stimulating morning so far. Before we dive into breakout groups, what I'd like to do is to take us through just 5-10 minutes of context setting. We've been hearing a lot about the route to net zero. It's also very important to understand a bit of the context globally, nationally, and also in the UK, and also what does it mean individually from a company perspective. So Ollie, if you could kindly go to the next slide, please. At the global level, it's clear that the climate emergency is really here, and already emissions have been exceeding where we need to be, and temperatures have risen by more than 1%. The task's clear. That's what the leaders are talking about in COP this week, and there's a real need to reduce our emissions by at least 50% over the next decade, by 2030. And to really put ourselves on the trajectory ultimately towards net zero. So the global challenge is important, is clear, and is being reflected in the UK now with a renewed strategy that the UK has. And Ollie, if you could kindly go to the next slide. To put these in context here, the net zero strategy that the government published last month really reinforces that commitment that the UK has to be net zero by 2050. It provides more clarity around the pathway to meet the 6th carbon budget that takes us through to 2037. And so now, from a UK perspective, what needs to be done at a strategic level is really being put down here, and the challenge laid to make sure that we're well into the 2030s and on the trajectory towards net zero. This cuts across all sectors. And to give a sense of where we are today, on the next slide, we can see this is data from the net zero strategy, where that at the moment the UK economy is still very much a fossil fuel based economy. There's of course been great strides around offshore wind and renewables, but we're very much still fossil fuel based. And the key emissions are coming from the sectors of buildings, transport, and industry. So the context is challenging, but the vision is also increasingly clear. And on the next slide, we could see where the different parts of the economy and in terms of energy generation and usage, where that needs to go to. The government has published a number of scenarios. There's various paths ultimately towards net zero. But what is clear is that a big shift will need to happen in terms of how energy is generated towards renewable energy, electrification. Hydrogen will probably be playing a very strong role, and fossil fuels will play a very minor role, if any, when we get to 2050. So that context is a massive shift. And over the next decade, we need to be well through that transition. At the end point, on the next slide, we can see what, in one of these scenarios, the residual emissions will look like, to give us a sense of where, really where we can have fully cut our emissions and where might there still be some. So Ollie, if you could kindly go to the next slide. You will see that in one of the scenarios, power has essentially been almost fully decarbonized, so is industry and domestic heating. And the remaining areas of highest emissions will be around aviation and shipping, agriculture and land use, and waste gases. And of course, to meet net zero, the country will need to offset that through greenhouse gas removals. But that's one picture of where we need to get to. So high degree of electrification, big role for hydrogen, and a big shift to really minimize what needs to ultimately be offset through greenhouse gas removals by the time we get to 2050. So that's the overall context for the UK. And now, what does this mean from a company perspective? So going on to the next slide, we have seen now that the Science-Based Targets Initiative, which is the standard by which companies are now measured around their ambition and the alignment of their targets to the climate goals, has just published on the 28th last week their new net zero standard. It's something that's been trailed for a number of months now, and now we're able to share what those requirements are. The key thing is that the SBTi is now asking companies to set targets that are both near-term and long-term. So in terms of near-term targets, Ollie, if you could just click through once, there is a ratcheting up of requirements for Scope 1 and 2 and Scope 3 targets. These targets need to be set within the next 5 to 10 years from a baseline year. Around Scope 1 and 2 now, this has already been embedded in the new requirements coming in middle of next year. Companies only have a possibility to align to a 1.5 trajectory, or 4.2% reduction on average every year. That is the cross-sector requirement. And around Scope 3, just giving the key headlines here, there will be two choices. One is to align to well below 2, or to align to 1.5. So that is roughly aligned to what the current science-based target requirements are for companies. Now, the new aspect is the next one. So clicking through to the next point is setting long-term targets. And there's now more clarity about what this actually means. Firstly, this will require a 90% decarbonization across scopes 1 and 2 and scope 3 for companies. And regarding scope 1 and 2, that is a cross-sector requirement around the 90% reduction. There was also going to be guidance on a sector-by-sector basis as to what that means. But across the board, for the cross-sectoral perspective, 90% decarbonization. That final 10% at most needs to be addressed through greenhouse gas removals. We'll come to that in a moment. Around scope 3, we're asked for near-term targets. The target boundaries are 2/3. When you get to long-term targets by 2050, they need to cover 90% of scope 3 emissions. And again, a 90% reduction by that year. There is also a physical or economic intensity reduction, whereas previously for short-term targets, these will be now 7% year-on-year reductions. They need to be 97% reduction in terms of the long-term targets. So all aligned to basically getting to net zero by 2050. Along the way, if you could click through to the next one, there is going to be an expectation that the companies should also be taking meaningful action outside of the value chain. So around offsetting the residual emissions they have down their journey through high quality offsets and taking other meaningful action. And some of the points we discussed earlier today in the program give an illustration of the kinds of work that companies can do to offset their emissions. The traditional offsets are not the same as what's going to be required at the endpoint to reach net zero. Clicking through to the final point, what these will require is neutralization of final residual emissions ramping up over time towards a 2050 target. And these will require permanent removal and storage of carbon from the atmosphere. So the type of offset will be very specific around that. So what we see here is what the journey needs to be like to be aligned to climate ambitions from a company perspective. To give a view of what these kinds of actions might look like, and we'll have a chance to talk about these in a little bit more depth in the actual breakouts. Ollie, if you could kindly click through to the next slide. Around scope 1 and 2 decarbonization, the kinds of actions, of course, will differ between different sectors, but the ones that will really move the dial will be procuring renewable energy. We're seeing a huge amount more demand now for green electricity. That is where, especially for service-based companies, or those where energy is mainly electric already, energy consumption is electric, then that is a significant opportunity. But also looking at areas of own transportation, moving towards electric vehicles or ultra-low emission vehicles, from light to passenger light to heavy good vehicles eventually. Then also around fuel combustion, there's going to be a bit more of a challenge for those that are energy intensive. The shift to hydrogen will be important, potentially electrification as well. Energy efficiency across the board will be really important. Energy efficiency is often really the first fuel of choice. It helps to make the business case to invest in other things by reducing your own consumption requirements. That's going to be really important. And finally, fugitive emissions as well, where those arise substantially within businesses, will be a key area to be tackled as well. Those are the broad levers. Moving on to the next slide around scope 3, looking at that across the whole, there's a number of things that companies can do and have an influence on directly or indirectly. With regards to supply chain, what you buy in terms of purchased goods and services, the scope 3 emissions and carbon embedded in that can be addressed through product design, for example, circular products and business models, which also have an influence in terms of downstream emissions and reducing that. Looking at collaboration with suppliers, in terms of logistics and transportation, but also driving energy efficiency and renewable uptake, and uptake of the ambition as well upstream will be really important. And then finally, also looking at what's happening at the end of life in terms of products will be also critical as well. So there's a universe of actions that companies can take. This will differ sector by sector, also perhaps on different points of the journey, but it will require collaboration. No company can address substantially the scope 3 emissions without substantial collaboration and engagement with suppliers upstream, with your customers downstream. And then finally, to look at the residual emissions, if we can go to the next slide, closing that final gap to net zero will require ultimately investment in greenhouse gas removals. And companies are already starting to take steps to that. Some are already committing to quite ambitious near-term net zero targets. And there's a range here of choices. There's a number that are more available today. And those are, for example, the nature-based solutions. Companies are already investing in that. And there will also be action and opportunities happening in more technological-based solutions. Today, these are some less available, higher cost, still immature, but in the future will provide a much higher scalability and less reversible capture of carbon. The SBTi requires companies to really be thinking about that today, to think about how they're going to invest into that, to make those commitments already as part of the net zero standard. And it's really important for companies to already be conscious about the level of investment and action that will be required to close that final gap, even though action will need to come later as you get towards your final year as 2050. So hopefully this sets the broad context, both globally, nationally within the UK, and setting this in the context of the company. And now welcome you to join our breakout sessions, which will be led by my colleagues. And in those sessions, we'll be looking at your thoughts and your views about the challenges and opportunities that this scene sets for you, and also what are the potential solutions to address that. So we really look forward to that interactive discussion and much more intimate setting, and you'll have an opportunity, I'm sure, to also ask a lot of questions you may have around these areas. So I'll hand back to Tiff and the team, and I think we'll be smoothly transitioned in a few seconds to our groups.
Great, thanks, Ellen. So yeah, you should have all been allocated to a group. So don't panic. This does take a couple of seconds to work, but you should all be allocated. So see you in the next session shortly. Welcome back, everyone, to the main session. Hopefully you enjoyed your breakout rooms led by our sector leads, and that you've come out feeling inspired with lots of insights and potentially more questions than what you had when you started, but that's all part of the fun. We're now going to continue with something a little bit different. So we're going to hear from Sophie Bordat from the Carbon Trust, who is this year's COP26 high-level climate champion in cooling, transformation and innovation. So I believe we are going to play a video in a second.
Hello, everyone. I'm Sophie Bordat, the Cooling Transformation Lead of the Climate Champions team. Thank you very much, Carbon Trust, for having me today. This, unfortunately, I can't make it to the official event, so you'll hear me as a pre-recorded video. But I'm really excited to be able to share some insights on the race to zero and cooling. So just in terms of what I'll cover today, I'll quickly run you through what the race to zero is, what it's been aiming to achieve ahead of COP, and more of an overview of why cooling is such an important sector that needs attention and action to reduce emissions, and then kind of high-level thoughts on the areas of interventions that organizations can take away and think about when they look at cooling more generally. So the race to zero, of course, well, it's day 3 at COP as you're attending this event virtually. So this race has really been set up as a UN-backed global campaign to bring non-state actors together to take ambitious action and make solid commitments on bringing net zero emissions to 2050, but also breaking that down into immediate action to halve emissions by 2030. When we say non-state actors, we really mean anything from cities, civil society, and businesses and investors and so on. So this is kind of the first campaign that's had a bigger push on non-government related officials related intervention to bring the water community and move action forward. And so it was designed in a year ago in 2020 and led by the high-level climate champions, so Nigel Topping from the UK and Gonzalo Munoz from Chile. And the main efforts have really been to try and get as many organizations to make these commitments and to be able then to demonstrate what they're doing post-cost effectively against their commitments. So how we've been able to do this, I think there's been amazing efforts. We can now count over 4,400 businesses in the race, almost 800 cities, 250 investors that really are essentially positioning themselves as leaders in terms of driving their climate ambition forward and making bold commitments that they will land in very concrete action and will hold themselves accountable against those targets. So as I said, it was really designed to try and land this at COP and recognize all these efforts at COP, but the race will be going and it's now turning into more of a community of practice of all these kind of climate actors and leaders in across many sectors to show and to reduce emissions to be in line with the Paris Agreement. Just so you can see kind of how the campaign has evolved since it was created and how quickly we've been able to pick up companies and regions and many stakeholders in the race. The biggest chunk, as I've said, are mainly companies across sectors such as consumer goods, retail, transport, energy, built environment and construction, and many more. And I think what's been really exciting is that in the last kind of run up to COP, we've seen the biggest number of commitments and companies joining the race. So just for those who are not aware of or would still be part, or would like to be part of this race, as an actor to join the initiative or the campaign, you would join through a partner initiative, because the Race to Zero is kind of an umbrella that tries to bring together all initiatives that have set some net zero criteria that meet the high level criteria that the Race to Zero set and has defined with technical experts. Just to give you an overview of how big the collaboration is and the number of initiatives that are involved, these are all the partner initiatives that have been validated through which an organization can join the Race to Zero. And I think the most relevant for the audience today would be the Business Ambition 1.5 set by the Science Based Target Initiative that has recently launched their net zero standard as well. And through joining those initiatives, you then sign up to the Race to Zero and part of this bigger kind of community of practice, as we like to call it. So now zooming into cooling and why within the Climate Champions, we think it was a really key sector to look at and to push in the race. The angle that we've taken was particularly engaging with cooling suppliers, but more broadly, it was important for us to share a bit more light on how important this sector is for our society, but also how big the share of emissions are. And effectively, if we don't tackle cooling emissions, we can't get to net zero globally. So before I describe the kind of the scale of emissions that the sector represents, what we mean by cooling is really anything that's either refrigeration or space cooling. And so cooling is quite a broad sector that cuts across many sectors and is really big, and it's everything from residential applications to commercial, industrial, and mobile applications. And so today, cooling emissions are 7% of global GHG emissions. This is really big. It's more than aviation and maritime transport combined. And how those emissions are kind of broken down, the biggest chunk, 75% of those, are mainly due to the intense energy usage of the equipment itself, and this will be particularly high where the carbon intensity of the grids that are powering these equipments in different regions are higher. And then the second chunk is around the refrigerants that these equipment use. So the refrigerants and insulation foam gases usually have a very high global warming potential. And so when these systems leak or reach their end of life, they have really extraordinarily big impact in terms of emissions and pollution. So it is a big chunk of emissions that need and require attention. And again, to kind of emphasize the impact it has on our grids, and in terms of energy demand, it's massive. In 2016, we've seen that just the energy demand for AC in buildings only totaled the amount of demand consumed in Japan and India in 2016. And so, you know, as we're thinking about this broader energy transition and net zero world, we really need to think about, okay, what about these systems that would actually put a lot of strain into our energy systems? And I think zooming into the UK, and looking at supermarkets, and so the retail sector, it is estimated that 50% of the energy used in supermarkets in the UK is for cooling. So although the UK doesn't have necessarily is characterized by a big cooling consumer compared to other countries, it's really, really much a big challenge within supply chains specifically. And I think the electricity consumption of retail in the UK represents 3% of the total energy demand in the UK. So again, really, really big impact in the UK. But so looking forwards and more broadly and globally, so today we're at 7%, but the cooling demand is expected to really boom, particularly for residential and commercial AC. And the IEA has predicted that by 2050, we should see the sector triple in size. And so that makes sense in given several factors. Obviously, cooling is critical to keep our thermal comfort and to protect us from rising temperatures. And we've seen the recent IPCC reports that is really predicting kind of serious implications of climate change and rising temperatures with heat waves that we're already seeing in colder climates affecting us, but in warmer climates, temperatures getting unlivable essentially. And so with the projected growth also reflects kind of a growth in urbanization and rising middle income, and then also increase in response for anything that's responding to the rise in global food demand and delivering new supply chains to markets where these don't exist. And so if we don't do anything, we might see a world where cooling emissions reach 25% global greenhouse gas emissions by 2050. And so once again, I think I want to reiterate that sort of energy strain that I've been highlighting throughout this presentation, but just to give you kind of a sense of the scale of cooling demand and its impacts, just in 2017, there was more added space cooling capacity for buildings than solar generation capacity added that year in terms of gigawatts. So I think that's quite striking because that means any new renewable kind of energy development was just straight up kind of swallowed by the added cooling demand. And in a warming world and with a rising demand of these services, again, we kind of need to think about how this whole energy transition will play out and how cooling comes into play here. So now that I've kind of set the scene on why it's a challenge and why at the Race to Zero, we've been thinking about this sector quite thoroughly and been trying to engage with cooling manufacturers to get them to join the race and make bold commitments to kind of show and trying to reduce the emissions of their appliances. I just want to show you one quick slide on the areas of intervention that are important to think about when you might look at cooling within your supply chains, within your systems, or even in your houses. So there's kind of 3 areas that we think the biggest impact on cooling are. So I think on one side is all about, okay, how can we reduce this energy consumption that is so intense and very straining for a system, for a grid, power grids specifically. And so the first thing would be, how can you reduce this demand in the first place, and how can you think about your supply chains or whatever kind of cooling need you may have to do that in a way that you will consume the least possible. And so this might mean thinking about passive measures, thinking about different ways of reducing air temperature or preserving food or whatever it is. And then really it's about having the most efficient appliances in place, and or like switching to alternative systems with, for example, centralized systems like district cooling that have demonstrated wonderful sort of cost opportunities, but also efficiency and reduced climate impacts. And then the second bit is tackling those refrigerant emissions and switching to ultra low global warming potential refrigerants that can be fit into cooling systems. And so, you know, the impact of a combined kind of holistic interventions that would combine these types of interventions is huge. And it's estimated that it can avoid roughly 4 to 8 years of total greenhouse gas emissions and could help us really bring the curve down. And I think as a climate champion, I'd like to again emphasize how important it is to join the race to zero, but push cooling suppliers as well to be part of this, and that can help bring more effort together and bring market signals and offer to any end user the right solutions that would be aligned with a 1.5 degree future. So my last slide is just to show you kind of our campaigning effort that we've done at the Race to Zero, and we've been tracking I think roughly 54 cooling suppliers, and we've managed to get 12 suppliers within the race, a lot of market leaders, and particularly on residential air conditioning, but also refrigeration and retail. But as you can see, there still are a lot of companies out there, and that dominates specific markets internationally, that could be part of this race and should demonstrate more effort. So hopefully this little snapshot just gives you an overview of kind of how we've assessed the market and where it is and who's part of this 1.5 pathway. So that was it for me. I'm really sorry I can't be at the virtual event live, but I would love to take any questions either on the Race to Zero or just dive into deeper discussions on cooling and what you can do as an organization. So feel free to send me an email and we can set up a discussion. For those of you, if any of you are at COP, I will be around until the 11th of November. So as well, send me an email and we'll be very happy to engage in any discussion. So thank you very much.
Amazing, some very striking figures there. As Sophie has just said, we will be able to direct any questions you have on clean cooling to her. And now I have the pleasure of introducing our closing keynote speaker of the day, which is Anne Miller, Director of the Creativity Partnership with over 35 years of experience in technological innovation, low carbon opportunities and organisational change. She was previously the co-founder of TTP Group PLC, which is one of Europe's leading independent technology innovation organisations. And she's also served on the board of the British Antarctic Survey and advises a number of charities as well alongside that. So please join me in welcoming Anne Miller.
Thank you very much. I've been a really interesting morning. I've really enjoyed listening in. I've worked in innovative SMEs much of my life, but I've also often been helping big corporations innovate and change. So I know just how hard and frustrating that can be, even when it seems blindingly obvious what the right thing to do is. So I'm sure many of you are struggling with that. And today we've been looking at the practicalities of how we get our organizations to net zero. But I want to remind us all about why we're doing this, why we need to keep moving as fast as we possibly can. And the first reason is that it's really simply a matter of survival. And could I have the first slide, please? So it's a completely unacceptable threat to the whole of humanity if we don't act now. We're already scarily close to a number of tipping points. And having been, as I said, involved with the British Antarctic Survey, it's particularly the sea ice melt that really worries me. And we're seeing ever increasing severe extreme weather events. it's morally unacceptable to know, but not to act. It's also a threat for our businesses if we don't act now. And I think emphasizing this aspect of risk in our businesses is a really helpful way of engaging others. So the big dinosaurs died out because they couldn't move fast enough. And that happens in business too. So the story of Kodak, I think, is always a really powerful cautionary tale to remind of people. Next slide, please. One of the world's most valuable brands in the 1990s, they refused to recognize the threat of digital photography, and they clung to analog film until it was much too late. So in fact, I remember one of their senior people telling me in about 2000, when digital was about 5% of the photography market, that they expected digital to rise to about 15% by 2015, which now seems hilarious. In 2005, they stopped selling analog film altogether. And in 2013, they filed for bankruptcy protection. So these fast-moving times are difficult for big corporates. It's really easy to see down about the devastation we see coming, the resistance we face in our organizations, the greenwash that we see in others, the vested interests, retarding things, the timid politicians. And if I can have the next slide, please. As Greta and the Queen both put it so aptly in their very different ways, it's blah, blah, blah. And as the Queen said, it's so irritating when they talk, but they don't do. But we need to keep going. We need to be ambitious, and we need to bring our colleagues and boards along with us. So the thing that keeps me motivated from my perspective of being involved in innovation is the knowledge that innovation is S-shaped. And if I could have the slide, please, I'll explain what I mean by that. So nothing seems to be happening for absolutely ages, and then things change faster than you could believe possible. And this is clear from the history of technological innovation, as one can see on this graph, from the electricity system to the car to the internet. The rate of change builds really slowly, then it reaches a tipping point and it grows rapidly until it reaches maturity and saturation. And then usually sometime later it starts to decline as a new wave of innovation takes over. So the video cassette recorder that's on that graph that was so hot in the 80s and 90s is already toast. And today fixed line phones are in notable decline while the smartphone continues to take over. And today renewable power is absolutely in the acceleration phase. And as Vaughan pointed out this morning, carbon removals is still in the slower growth phase, but that will change. So a key thing is that things change faster than we think. So if I could have the next slide, please. So, and policy and vested interest often don't realize that innovation follows this S-curve. So they wildly underestimate the pace of change. They think that change would happen at the rate it used to, and that change is linear. So this graph here shows an astonishingly incorrect set of forecasts from the International Energy Agency, which repeatedly failed to register the accelerating rate of PV installations. So each year they assumed that the rate of installations of PV would be like it had been in the past. And so that's why on these graphs you see all these horizontal forecast lines coming up, whereas the black line is what's actually happening. And when you're in the early stages of this S innovation curve, the future is not like the past. And so things happen much faster than the policymakers and the vested interests and the blind expect. And that was part of Kodak's problem. So another thing that keeps me motivated is the realization that things are interconnected. So actions add together and reinforce each other in really quite complex ways. So even if, as for many of us, our personal actions feel completely inadequate response to the challenges that we see ahead and the dangers, those responses may be much more impactful than we think, so long as what we're doing is also enabling or encouraging others. Then it becomes a vital part of the whole. So if I could have the next slide, please. In around 2009, President Obama's young daughter asked him to do something about saving the tigers. And he writes in his autobiography that this was a key part of his decision to make tackling climate change a priority in his presidency. And though Malia was in a sort of an unusually, uniquely influential position for a child, it's an important reminder of the leverage we can have when influencing others. And as a business, just to share a few of my personal favorite examples, it can be as simple as giving a lower carbon versions of your product a higher profile than the high carbon ones. So in Cambridge, where I'm at the moment, the University Catering Service wanted to reduce the carbon footprint of the food they served. So they started by training the chefs, who had obviously had a very meat-based training program traditionally. And then they removed ruminant meat from the menus while increasing the number and variety of the vegetarian and vegan options. Just made the vegetarian and vegan options look incredibly tasty and appetizing. And they also used subtle sort of nudge techniques, including placing the vegetarian and vegan options before the meat options in the displays and changing how things were labeled. The result of these really simple changes was that within, I think it was 1 or 2 years, it reduced the carbon footprint of the food they served by a third. And it also increased profitability by, I think, about 2%. So simple, but really effective steps. And as we've been discussing, of course, it's incredibly valuable to encourage and help your SME suppliers. So you, well, your suppliers in general, but also your SMEs, so you can reduce the scope 3 emissions of your supply chain. So I rather like the example of what Ben & Jerry's have done with their milk suppliers to reduce the methane emissions from the cows. So it includes investing in the technologies, the research and development, the research trials, looking at agricultural practices to reduce on-farm emissions. And so, for example, they were helping fund manure separators and biodigesters. And interestingly, some of the funding for this came from Ben & Jerry's internal carbon tax, which they set up. And I think this is a really nice idea for both mobilizing the practical funding to enable you to provide tangible help to your SMEs, and also to motivate action and awareness, both internally within your organization, because now there's a tax on internal carbon emissions, and externally in your supply chain. So in another SME I worked with, when they got the heads around the idea of scope 1, scope 2, scope 3, and they moved on to start thinking about their scope 3 emissions, they realized that simply by changing the default shipping method on their website from air freight to surface, this reduced their carbon footprint by more than any other measure. And as most of their customers were actually academics buying research equipment, very often they didn't mind that it took a bit longer to arrive, as long as it was there in time for the next academic year. So the cumulative impact of all these little changes is actually really exciting. And in some cases, it's going to result in really dramatic system change. And it's when we get to this system change that it gets really exciting. So if I could have the next slide, please. I'm sure many of you have switched at least some of your fleet from internal combustion engines to EVs. And this is a good thing to do, but as we all realize, it can feel a bit inadequate. But it's part of a system change. The more EVs there are around, the more incentive there is to install charging points. And the more charging points there are, the more incentive there is to have an EV. And your drivers will start enthusing about EVs to their mates. So they'll buy them too, either as businesses or as individuals. To get cheaper charging, when businesses start using more EVs, they may start wanting to install PV on the buildings, on the logistics centres, and do power purchase agreements. Helps avoid price shocks. And each EV has a battery, and so before you know it, there's a huge number of EV batteries around. And renewable power systems are hungry for storage. So I'm really excited about the potential for new artificial intelligence-driven business models where EV and battery owners are paid to provide flexible storage facilities to the grid, subject to their vehicle being fully charged again by the time they've told the system that they're going to need the vehicle. This is really transformational when it happens at scale. And it starts blurring the boundaries between the power sector and the automotive sector, which were previously considered as completely separate sectors. So, and then in turn, obviously, this storage dramatically improves the utilization of renewables, which reduces the cost of power still further. And so some, I'm thinking here of the interesting think tank Rethinks, are projecting that within a few decades, in many parts of the world, renewable power will often be virtually free, so long as you can use or storage at the right time. So what changes in business models does that bring? That is really exciting. So this is the power sector. It's just one small area of change. And precisely what the future will look like is, of course, uncertain. We can never know. But as businesses, we have the power to move fast, to be bold, to ride this wave and help create the future. So it's a bit scary, but it's also exciting. So let's do it. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Anne. That was such interesting and quite different insight as well, which is always great to see, and just recognizing how fast change is actually happening. I think that graph of the PV installation will probably stick with a few of us. And also thank you for all your great examples, and it's such a great reminder to all of us that, you know, we are all in some ways levers and influencers for this change, and that, you know, for this change that we're all working so hard to achieve, and that all these cumulative changes really do result in kind of big impactful system changes. So thank you so much for joining us. Finally, we are going to have our closing remarks, which will be done by our Managing Director in Business Services, Hugh Jones. And this will conclude at the end of our session.
Thank you very much indeed, Tiff. And well, a big hello to everybody, and for all of you who have been here with us all morning. Really hope that you've enjoyed the sessions as much as I have. I just wanted to make a few summary comments, and then we will definitely let you go by 1 o'clock. There were a couple of polls that were set out earlier, and I think we might have some results on the slides. Yes, so very briefly, you were actually pretty evenly split in your self-assessment of where you've got to as organizations on the route to net zero. I think as of some of today's discussion and the coming months and years will show, some of you may want to revise these assessments. It's going to be a long but necessary journey. I think it's really good to see a balanced view among you there. And then the second poll was around the confidence in the UK's own net zero target. And yeah, again, fairly split. Quite notable, I think, that over a quarter of you are somewhat sceptical about the position at the moment. I would say that's a healthy skepticism, and we absolutely need to be paying attention to this. We can't just assume it's going to be okay. So yeah, interesting views from you there. Moving forward from the polls, I would first of all like to say big thank you to, if you could just move on to the next slide, please. I'd like to say thank you to all of our speakers and contributors to what's been a really fascinating morning. So that's our external speakers, Elliot Whittington, Vaughan Lindsay, and just now Anne Miller. And of course, our panelists, Paul Owen Rhodes, David Fitzgerald, and Rose Sandell. And then from the Carbon Trust home team, we had Tom, Dominic, Pauline, Elaine, Sophie, the 6 breakout leads, and of course, Tiff. So great thanks to all of you too. We heard some recurring and I would say key themes through the day. So I've made a note of 4 or 5 of them here. There was the urgency for more action and for more detailed policies. There was the momentum of the sector that we're in, but of course, the attendant risk of greenwash that comes with that momentum. There's the need for policy and business to go hand in hand to further bridge the gap, because there is a gap. There's the need to work increasingly up and down supply chains. And there's very much the need for innovation. We heard about innovation both in an industry setting. We heard about the clean cooling example, and also the kind of sector transformation example of the the interface of power and automotive. But we also heard something about the need for innovation in-house for all of us. And I think Anne made some really interesting points there about the cumulative impact of lots and lots of actions and innovations eventually affecting system change, which is of course what we need. Earlier on, we had an in-depth, fascinating insight into the voluntary carbon market from Vaughan at Climate Care and its drivers of consumer momentum, investors, and increasingly corporate peer pressure. And in fact, some of the key themes came out here too. I would say notably the one about momentum and the potential risks to quality and greenwashing. That was very much, I think, underpinning some of the discussion on the voluntary carbon market. And of course, you yourselves participated in the 6 sector breakout. So thank you very much for all of your input into those. We will circulate a broad summary article, including an overview of the themes, challenges, and opportunities within each sector. And we will be looking to do that to everybody within the next week or so. And a number of you as valued partners of ours will already be in discussions with us and perhaps with one another on some of the sector challenges, and we look forward to continuing those with you. And I think most of all, having thanked all of our speakers and contributors, we would like to thank you because as the audience, you are already proactive participants in the UK's fight against climate change. A couple of the speakers earlier discussed the role of UK companies, and it is notable, but I was just checking just now, and as of today, the UK has finally actually overtaken the US. It has more companies signed up with 1.5 degree science-based targets than any other country in the world. There are 125 of you now, and that's a really great achievement. We've worked with many of you on this, and congratulate you again. But as we all know, a net zero today, or net zero target today, it's just a commitment. It's not yet an achievement. We've heard from the panelists about the importance of a top-down commitment, deep supplier engagement, data that you can trust. These are all going to be elements of making net zero real. And Pauline earlier showcased our forthcoming route to net zero standard. And as you will see, that is all about supporting organizations on the route to net zero, which is an extremely challenging but absolutely essential journey. And we hope to work with you on that journey. And with that, I would just like to say a big thank you to Maddie and the events team for another superb event. And we're going to leave you with the brief video which we talked about earlier. So thank you very much again.